The wind whipped across the top of the wall, sending sharp gusts of icy air through every gap in the rough-hewn stones. Frost clung to the edges of crags and splinters of ice dangled precariously, reflecting the faint lights of lanterns like shards of stars. Night was falling, and with it came a bitter chill that seeped through wool and leather and bit into bone. Men of the Night's Watch patrolled the ramparts as they had for centuries, black shadows against an endless stretch of white. Despite the routine bustle, clanking chains, shifting furs, muttered curses, there was a hush beneath it all, a tension as taut as a crossbow string. Jon Snow stood near the edge, gazing out into the swirling darkness. A soft flurry had begun, each snowflake descending like a silent herald. He watched those tiny flakes vanish into the abyss below, consumed by the towering void that was the northern side of the wall. He was alone for the moment, away from the other brothers, away from the echoes of boots on stone, collecting his thoughts. Even now, despite his black cloak, he thought of himself as belonging to two worlds. Half-brother of Robb Stark, half-steward to Lord Commander Mormont, half-grown in Winterfell but half-claimed by the Night's Watch. Half-traitor, some might say, for the love in his heart that refused to die. The love in his heart wore fiery hair and had a voice as fierce and untamed as any wind raging across this frozen expanse. It was her memory that had brought him out here, her name that stirred in every chamber of his mind until he came out into the cold just to let the wind attempt to chase her from him. Ygritte. Every recollection of her made his heart clench with guilt and longing. He had betrayed her. He had left her behind to return to the Night's Watch. Her scars and her bright, wild eyes haunted him daily. He felt them now, though only a memory, as if her gaze were pressing into the back of his skull. He closed his eyes, breathing in the searing chill. A swirl of thoughts flitted by, memories of her laughter echoing off cave walls, her bare skin against his, the shape of her lips. Then came the pang of regret. Perhaps in another life, he would have stayed with her and forsaken this vow, or perhaps he would have been honest from the start, letting her know who he truly was. "I am the sword in the darkness," Jon Snow whispered, reciting the words beneath his breath in a quivering hush. Even as he repeated the oath of the Night's Watch, a part of him felt hollow. He let out a slow breath that misted in front of him, drifting into the gloom. Overhead, the half-moon was veiled by shifting clouds, casting the ice below in a pale silver luminescence. From behind him, footsteps sounded, and Jon instinctively turned, hand creeping toward the hilt of Longclaw. It was Dolorous Ed, face scrunched against the wind, humorless as ever. "Jon, they're calling for you down below. The Lord Commander's returned from his meeting and wants the men ready at dawn to reinforce the gate," he said, voice half lost in the wind. Jon nodded, stepping away from the edge, though not without one final, lingering glance northward. "Right, I'll be down in a moment." Dolorous Ed nodded in return and trudged away, black cloak swallowing him up in the gloom. Jon stood there for a heartbeat longer, taking in the dark horizon, aware that somewhere out there, Mance Rayder and his army of free folk were gathering like a storm front, unstoppable and cold. With a sigh, he turned and made his way down the icy steps, each footfall echoing on frozen stone. He did not see, through the flickering torchlight, the small shape that clung like a wraith to the underside of a rampart. He did not hear the hushed exhalation, nor glimpse the shock of red hair that blended with the shadows. He did not sense how near she was, how her eyes burned at the sight of him. She remained silent, breath shallow, her fingers clenched around the polished curve of a bow. Her chest trembled with each heartbeat, poised between longing and hatred. For now, Ygritte watched, and the wind carried away all trace of her presence. During the long hours that followed, Castle Black was restless. Word had spread that the free folk were planning another assault. The tunnels beneath the wall, the great gates, the winches, the catapults, everything needed to be tested and rechecked. Brothers scurried about, some shaking off sleep, others squinting under flickering lanterns, verifying that the defenses would hold. In truth, few believed a victory was likely if Mance Rayder came in force, but they would fight and die as the oath demanded. The men of the Night's Watch seemed resigned, eyes steeled with grim fatalism. Jon was in the common hall, pushing around the last scraps of supper on a wooden trencher. Porridge, overcooked, watery, and flecked with lumps. Even for the wall, it was poor fare, a reflection of dwindling stores. He wasn't really hungry, and the half-full bowl only served as an excuse to remain seated a while longer, to let his bones recover from the biting wind. Samwell Tarly sat across from him, fidgeting with a spoon, his round cheeks flushed from either the cold or anxiety. They say the wildlings have a new plan. Something about climbing the wall at multiple points and using giant slings to lob stones over the top. Sam muttered. Does that even make sense? How would they? Jon shrugged. Mance knows what he's doing. He's cunning as any lord in the South, maybe more so. He's not some savage. He was a brother of the Watch once. He understands our weaknesses. Yes, of course, Sam said, letting out a shaky breath. Still, I wish there was a parley, or a way to avoid bloodshed. There's enough trouble in the realm as it is. Jon set down his spoon. War doesn't ask for our wishes. It only gives us choices between what must be done and what can't be avoided. His tone held a heaviness that Sam recognized. Sam glanced around, noting the battered tables, the stale smell of unwashed men, the shuffle of hobnailed boots across the stone floor. I heard about you and her, he said softly, not quite meeting Jon's eyes. I'm sorry. I know it must be difficult. Jon's shoulders tensed. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he finally said, We all have ghosts. She's mine. It was a curt response, but Sam said nothing more, understanding well enough that to pry would only deepen the wound. They finished their meal in silence as the hall emptied, men drifting off to rest or to watch duty. Lamps burned low. Eventually, they rose and parted ways. Sam retreated to the library tower, mumbling about finishing some record-keeping. Jon found himself treading the stairways and corridors aimlessly, trying to lose himself in the monotony of the keep's interior. He passed doorways where men snored, past storerooms piled with half-rotten supplies, and even the raven's rookery where a few birds croaked in the darkness. At last, he ended up in the small courtyard within the walls, where the battered practice dummies stood in lonely rows. Torches flickered against the stone, and a swirl of flakes drifted down from above, the open sky a patch of black edged by ramparts. It was quiet here, save for the distant whistle of wind. Perfect for a moment's reflection, he thought. He clenched his fists and began to practice the forms, basic strokes and parries with an imaginary blade. He tried to let the movements calm him, focusing on muscle memory, on breathing. His breath left his lips in ghostly puffs, dissolving into the cold. Again and again, he repeated the forms. He spun, twisted, thrust into empty air. He envisioned foes in front of him, marauding wildlings, wights from beyond the wall, or even white walkers from some distant nightmare. Each time, he struck them down in his mind. But the only image that truly haunted him appeared in flashes. A spear wife with hair kissed by fire, heartbreak in her eyes, and the inevitable moment she would draw back her bow. He stopped, chest heaving, a bead of sweat trickling down his brow despite the chill. The forms were meant to ground him, but his thoughts remained adrift. He stared at his hands, remembering the nights he had shared with her, how their fingers had intertwined. He thought he had severed that tie, but in truth, it still bled within him. An odd, prickling sensation raised the hairs on the back of his neck. It was a sense of being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the shadows at the edge of the courtyard, near the corners where torchlight didn't reach. Nothing moved, only the flicker of a flame, the dull shape of half-crumpled dummies, the swirl of snow. He waited, senses straining. He heard only his own heartbeat and the low moan of the wind. With a final, unsettled glance at the perimeter, Jon left the courtyard, deciding to return to the barracks. But in the gloom behind him, half crouched against the stone, a figure remained. The faint reflection of torchlight sparkled in her eyes, and in her hands, she still gripped a bow. She watched his retreat, lips parted, breath shaking. The ghost of a memory, the glimmer of regret, and then hatred overcame all else. Night wore on, the hours a blur of cold and anxious preparation. High up on the wall, the wind carried rumors of movement beyond the forest. Some said they saw campfires in the distance, like fallen stars scattered across the horizon. Others claimed to hear horns on the wind, the guttural growls of giants. But the gloom revealed nothing certain. It was just the watch and their nightmares, perched upon a wall of ice with no promise of salvation. Jon found a restless sleep in the barracks. He drifted in and out of dreams that merged with memories, images of family in Winterfell, of his dire wolf, ghost, padding silently across the snow, of Ygritte's laughter, and of the day he left her behind. Each scene was tinged with sorrow. When he finally awoke, it was with a start, drenched in sweat despite the sub-zero air. He rubbed his eyes and rose from the bunk, shoulders stiff. He dressed quickly, pulling on layers of black wool, a thick leather jerkin, and finally his cloak. He belted Longclaw at his side with mechanical efficiency. Others in the barracks were still stirring, some snoring, others stretching or tugging on boots. Pale morning light seeped through a narrow slit of a window, illuminating clouds of dust in the stale air. Outside, dawn was a fragile thing, the sun hidden behind dull gray clouds that threatened another snowstorm. A few men from the watch were already at their posts, half asleep and grumbling. No wildling assault had come in the night, which created an uneasy hush in the morning. Tension built as they awaited the next blow that might fall. Jon gathered with a handful of rangers and stewards in the courtyard. Lord Commander Mormont had them splitting chores for the day, reinforcing a section of the outer rampart, preparing hot oil, checking the supply of arrows. As Jon helped direct men to different tasks, he felt the press of 1,000 concerns swirling around him. But above it all, he felt a nagging sense, the same eerie chill that had plagued him in the courtyard last night. He tried to dismiss the notion as paranoia. The free folk were out there, yes, but Ygritte would be miles away if she was with them at all. Or so he told himself. Deep down, he knew she was near, because he could feel it in his bones, just as one senses an oncoming storm through the changing of the air. Work continued through the morning, halting only for a quick midday meal of stale bread and jerky. Jon found himself on the walkway overlooking the northern side again, looking for any sign of movement in the distance. The vast expanse of white and gray seemed empty, but that only deepened his unease. The wildlings could be hiding in the woods or in hollows, waiting for the right moment. He remained on the walkway with Gren for a time, exchanging jokes about the meager rations and speculating about the next attack. Their laughter was half-hearted, as if both realized how fleeting humor could be in such a place. At one point, Jon let his gaze drift upward to the swirling gray sky, thinking of the old gods, wondering if they watched all this with indifference. It was then that a horn blast sounded in the distance, long and low. Jon's heart seized. Gren froze, hand clutched on the hilt of his weapon. Other brothers along the wall snapped to attention, scanning the horizon. Another blast echoed, then silence. "That's them," Gren said under his breath. "They're testing us." Jon grimaced. "Be ready." A call came from below to man the positions to check the gates. Runners carried the message up and down the stairs. The free folk might be making a probing attack. Jon hurried along the walkway, shouting orders, telling men to take vantage points. He found himself at the top of the main stair, looking over a cluster of archers. The horns had stopped, and a hush fell again, as if the entire world waited. In that moment, with adrenaline tightening his grip on Longclaw's hilt, Jon almost forgot his lingering dread, the sense of being watched by someone closer than any army. He surveyed the land from a narrow embrasure, seeing only the outline of the forest and the slope of the frosted hills beyond. Then a cry echoed from the southern side of the courtyard. A guard had spotted movement by one of the lesser-used approaches near the base of the wall, a flicker of a shadow, too small to be a raiding party. The alarm rose, men shouting, crossbows loaded. John rushed down from the walkway, cloak trailing behind him, footfalls echoing on stone. He reached the courtyard in time to see men scattering in confusion, searching for something. But no wildling was found. There was no sign of anyone. The guard swore he'd seen someone vanish into a doorway leading to an old storage chamber. John, with a handful of others, searched the chamber with torches, revealing only crates of mildewed rope and battered barrels. A few rats scurried, annoyed by the intrusion. The guard muttered apologies, uncertain now if it had been a trick of the light. Eventually, Lord Commander Mormont had them return to their posts, cursing under his breath about jumpy men and false alarms. John's nerves refused to settle. In his gut, he knew something was off, something beyond an overzealous guard. Once the men dispersed, he stood alone in that dusty storage chamber, torchlight flickering across the stone walls. Dust motes spun in the orange glow. A single set of footprints led in, but none led out. Yet the chamber was otherwise undisturbed. Was it imagination or a cunning infiltration? He brushed a gloved hand across the footprints. They were small, lighter than a man's. His heart gave a jolt. No, he thought, banishing the notion. She wouldn't come here alone. She'd never get this far inside the fortress without being seen. Or if she was this close, then she had help. His mind raced with the possibilities. One thing was certain. The ghost of her memory was no longer confined to dreams. Pressing his lips into a grim line, he left the chamber and replaced the torch in its sconce. He told no one of his suspicions. Until he had proof, he would keep the fear contained. If he was wrong, he'd only cause panic. If he was right, well, better to face her on his own terms. Time passed slowly, and the second horn never followed. Night came, and with it another uneasy hush. The day's labors, combined with the relentless cold, had worn many of the men to exhaustion. They retired to their bunks early, seeking what comfort and warmth they could in the communal quarters. John, however, found that rest evaded him. He lingered in the courtyard, a cloak of swirling snow around him, eyes glancing at every movement in the corners. He felt drawn to a specific tower, half abandoned, once used for storing lumber. Rumor said the upper floors had collapsed in a fire decades ago, leaving only the lower levels intact. Few ever went there now. John made his way across the yard, stepping quietly, his breath fogging the air. He pushed open the tower's creaking wooden door and slipped inside. The interior was dank, shadows dancing on rough stone walls. Cobwebs clung to corners. A thin corridor led into a circular chamber that smelled of rot and old ash. Moonlight filtered through a single slit window, illuminating scattered debris. John stood there in silence, scanning for footprints, any hint of a concealed presence. He saw no sign. He didn't know why he kept expecting her. Perhaps he was haunted by a phantom of guilt, searching for closure. He closed his eyes and steadied his breathing, letting the hush wrap around him. He recalled the cave they once shared, how the dim, warm darkness had made the outside world seem distant, how she'd teased him, calling him a steward who knew nothing, how they had laughed, two young lovers entwined by fate. A soft scuff on the floor behind him shattered his reverie. He spun. By the faint glow of moonlight, he made out a silhouette near the door. A slender figure, bow in hand, cloak brushed with frost. And there, framing her face, the wild tangles of red hair. "Ygritte," John breathed, his voice a whisper. He dared not raise it. She did not respond. She stood in the threshold, gaze locked on him. The air crackled with tension. Why?" he began, but the words died on his tongue. The question was pointless. They both knew why she was here. Her voice came, low and trembling with suppressed emotion. "We told you. We said if you were playing us for fools, we'd kill you. You remember that?" Her accent sharpened each word, sending a pang through him. John swallowed, heart pounding. He took a hesitant step forward, but she raised the bow fractionally. "I remember," he said softly, "but I never meant to betray you. I had no choice." A flicker of pain crossed her face. "You always have a choice," she snapped. her knuckles going white around the bow's grip. I gave you a chance to be free with me. You stayed in that cave, and for a moment you were mine. Then you left. She broke off, her expression contorting as if waging an inner war. You traitor, she hissed. Jon's breath caught. He took another step, raising his hands slowly, palms outward, trying to show he meant no harm. I can't abandon my vows, Ygritte. I tried to be true to both, but I couldn't live a lie forever. Her eyes glistened in the faint moonlight. And you think I can? After what you've done, you think I can just walk away from what I swore? She bit her lip, and he saw how her emotions churned beneath that fierce exterior. You can come with me, he said, hardly believing the words escaping his mouth. We can find a way. It doesn't have to end like this. She let out a bitter laugh. You know nothing, Jon Snow. That phrase, once filled with teasing and warmth, now cut deeper than any blade. Jon lowered his gaze. Then kill me, he said quietly. If your hate is stronger than what we had, finish it. I won't raise my sword against you. He unbuckled his sword belt and let Longclaw drop to the floor with a dull clank. He slid it aside with a foot, then raised his hands again in surrender. Ygritte's eyes flicked to the blade, then back to him. Her breath shook. She had come this far. She had told herself all the way that she would put an arrow in his heart if she ever saw him again. Yet the sight of him, the sound of his voice, made her ache in places she thought had gone numb. She stepped inside, silently kicking the door shut behind her. The latch clicked in the quiet. Her bow remained aimed. We have to open the gate for Mance, she said in a ragged whisper, as if half reminding herself of her purpose. We have to take Castle Black. You'll warn your crows. Jon shook his head, his voice urgent but gentle. I have a duty, Ygritte, just as you do. But that doesn't mean. She didn't let him finish. Her arm trembled, and the arrow inched back on the string. You lied to me? She spat, hot tears threatening to break loose. You lied, and you left me. He took a step closer, and the arrow pointed at his chest, barely a yard away now. If she loosed, it would be over in an instant. He gazed into her eyes, words tumbling out in a broken rush. I never wanted to lie, but I had no choice. I loved you. A heartbeat of silence. The arrow trembled in her grip. She blinked, tears threatening, lips parted in a silent sob. I loved you too, she managed, voice cracking. Her resolve wavered, and for a moment, she almost lowered the bow. Then the memory of betrayal seized her, stiffening her spine. She sucked in a sharp breath, eyes filling with fury. You left me? She repeated, as if by saying it again, she could reinforce the hatred that needed to guide her hand. You left me with nothing but an ache. You could have run with me, but you chose them. Jon didn't flinch. He swallowed once, tears burning his own eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. I never wanted it to be like this. Time seemed to slow. Her fingers trembled on the string. He saw every minute motion of her face, the flicker of anguish and rage. He felt the heat of her presence, so close. He knew she was torn, as was he. If only he could reach her, touch her hand, show her he meant it. But that moment had passed. Her release was sudden, almost reflexive. The bow twanged, and the arrow leaped forth. Jon barely gasped before it struck him in the chest, slicing through layers of leather and wool. Pain tore through him like lightning. He stumbled back, knees buckling, breath shattered by the impact. Shock replaced every coherent thought. Ygritte's eyes widened, a silent scream forming on her lips. She hadn't realized she'd loosed the arrow until it was too late. She saw him crumple to the floor, saw the arrow protruding from just beneath his collarbone. Blood spread across his cloak, dark and hot. He let out a ragged breath, eyes rolling back. No, she choked, rushing forward, dropping her bow. She fell to her knees beside him. No, no, no. She pressed her hands to the wound, voice trembling. I didn't mean. Jon coughed, blood flecking his lips. His eyes fluttered open, barely focusing. Ygritte, he managed. Weakness claimed him and darkness loomed. She hovered over him, panic flooding her veins. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her heart refused to leave him. She pressed down on the wound, though the warm flow of blood only quickened. She had seen men die of arrow wounds. In that moment, all her hatred drowned under a tidal wave of grief. "Hold on," she whispered, tears dripping onto his pale face. She shook him gently. "Hold on, Jon Snow. You have to." He tried to speak but only coughed, eyes unfocused, breath rasping. She felt the life slipping away from him as if it were an actual presence draining out onto the cold stone. She realized then that she had done what she swore. She had killed him. There was no turning back. Panic gave way to urgency. The corridor outside was empty for the moment, but soon the watch would hear. They'd come running. They'd see her kneeling over a dying brother with a bow in hand. They'd kill her. But more than that, she realized, she couldn't bear to be parted from him now that she had done this. A strangled sob tore from her throat. She glanced around in frantic despair, eyes alighting on a small door to the side. She had scouted earlier, knowing this tower offered a way out through a half-hidden postern gate. If she was going to survive, she had to flee now. But she couldn't leave him. For some reason, that thought anchored her more than the fear of death. She drew a shaking breath and knelt lower, cradling his head. Her fingers traced the curve of his cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. There in the tower's gloom, they locked eyes one last time, and she saw his love, his regret, everything that had gone unsaid. Then his eyes closed, breath shallow. She had to go. She couldn't let them capture her. Slowly, she laid his head down. Her cheeks burned with tears. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, voice almost inaudible. She rose unsteadily, blood staining her hands. She swallowed hard, forced herself to look at him one more time. The arrow jutted from his chest, bright red seeping across black cloth, the color draining from his face. If there was any chance for him to survive, the arrow would have to be removed. A maester would have to bind and stitch the wound. But she knew how arrows killed, how they tore the insides if not carefully removed. She had aimed for his heart. "Goodbye," she whispered, stepping back. Her heart cracked. Then she turned and fled through the side door, slipping into the cold night, carrying her sorrow and guilt into the darkness. A scream sounded within the tower shortly after. A steward had stumbled upon Jon's body and raised the alarm. Men poured in, torches lighting the small room in a wild glow. They knelt around him, voices frantic, cursing the gods. They lifted his limp form, carrying him to Maester Aemon's chambers. But blood stained every corridor, leaving a dreadful trail. Dolorous Ed, Gren, PYP, Sam. All stood by, faces pale, as the old maester tried desperately to stanch the flow. The arrow was lodged near the heart. Aemon, trembling with age, could barely steady his instruments. Brothers held Jon down while the maester attempted to extract the arrowhead without causing further damage. The procedure took agonizing minutes, accompanied by Jon's weak, ragged moans. But even once the arrow was removed, the wound bled profusely. Maester Aemon worked through the night with various potions, poultices, and bandages. The men outside prayed to the gods, old and new alike, while a hush spread across Castle Black. They feared that their brother was lost. They cursed the wildling who did it, speaking in hushed, hateful voices. Word spread quickly that Ygritte, his wildling woman, had been spotted, that she must have come inside. Some whispered that Jon had let her in, that he was a traitor again. Others merely spat on the ground and hoped she'd be hunted down. After hours of labor, Maester Aemon finally emerged, his frail face grave. He shook his head. "He lives, for now," he said, voice nearly a whisper. "But his condition is dire. Only the gods can say if he'll survive." The men let out a collective breath, relief mixed with dread. Ed, Gren, and PYP took turns standing vigil, but no one was allowed inside the chamber except for the maester and a single steward to assist. Mormont came by, pale with worry. He placed a hand on the door and cursed under his breath, lamenting the life of another brave young man slipping away on his watch. Jon lay upon a cot, bandaged tightly across his torso. His breathing was shallow, face ashen. Eamon trickled essence of poppy between his lips to keep him sedated, to ease the agony. From time to time, Jon would stir, eyes flickering, lips moving without sound. His mind drifted through feverish dreams, blizzards and wolves, red-haired women with arrows, the faint echo of a vow whispered on the wind. In the yard below, men scoured every corner for an intruder. Hounds sniffed about, but the swirling snow and shifting winds masked any trail. A solitary watchman on the southern rampart claimed to see a lone figure slipping over the ruined palisade. By the time they searched, that figure was gone. All they found were footprints that led into the night. Days passed. Jon drifted between life and death, conscious only in fleeting moments. Once, Ed held a cup of water to his cracked lips. Another time, Sam hovered anxiously, whispering prayers. Each time, Jon's eyes fluttered, his skin clammy, mind too burdened by delirium to truly see them. The fever that raged in his body showed him illusions. His family in Winterfell, the old gods in the Weirwood Grove, Ygritte's laughter and tears. Sometimes he heard ghostly horns calling from beyond the wall, or the distant howling of a dire wolf. In these dreams, he reached for a sword that was never within grasp. Meanwhile, Castle Black remained braced for an attack that did not come. The Free Folk seemed quiet, perhaps regrouping. Runners arrived with news from Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower. No large-scale movement had been detected, just scattered groups testing the edges. Some believed Mance Rayder was plotting something bigger, biding his time until the Night's Watch was further weakened. All the while, Ygritte lingered just out of sight. She had made a camp for herself in the foothills, alone. She told herself that she would return to Mance with information, show that she had done her duty. Yet she could not bring herself to go. The thought of seeing the scorn on the faces of her people, telling them she had taken Jon's life, filled her with a hollow ache. She didn't know if it was regret or grief or both. She barely slept, haunted by the memory of his face, the blood on her hands. She told herself he was dead. The arrow had struck near his heart. No man could survive that. She told herself again and again that there was no way he lived. She had felt his heartbeat slow under her palms. Yet something in her refused to believe it fully. A lingering ember of doubt gnawed at her, compelling her to move closer to the wall at night, to watch from the treeline, to see if there was word of his passing. She heard rumors from passing wildlings that no one inside Castle Black wore black armbands or seemed to hold any funeral pyre, that only deepened the turmoil in her chest. Winter winds buffeted her small camp, flinging snow against her tattered cloak. She ate little, drifting in and out of a haunted trance. During the day, she might half-heartedly hunt a squirrel, or gather kindling or check her gear, but every action was mechanical. When night fell, she would creep close enough to see the faint lights of the fortress, listening for any sign, hoping and dreading in equal measure. After another endless twilight, she found herself crouched at the edge of the forest. Castle Black's torches glowed in the distance. She studied the walls, the guards that patrolled, scanning for a weakness or a way in. She scarcely knew her own intentions anymore. Revenge, regret, redemption. All she knew was that she could not leave this behind. Not yet. Inside, Jon Snow lay upon his cot, breath shallow. Maester Aemon had done all he could, but infection set in, ravaging his body with fever. The old man recited the healing prayers, applied poultices, forced water down Jon's throat. Brothers took turns sponging his brow, speaking to him in quiet tones. Sam read aloud from old tomes about the Night's Watch, about the Age of Heroes. He believed that hearing familiar voices might tether Jon to the living world. But still Jon drifted in that gray space between life and death, dream and reality. In his half-lucid dreams, he saw Ygritte standing over him, tears in her eyes, lips forming apologies. He felt her hand on his cheek. He wanted to speak to her, to tell her everything was all right, to beg her forgiveness for leaving. But no words would come, and she would fade like mist. Then the dream would shift, and he'd be back in Winterfell, a boy chasing after Robb with wooden swords, or in the Godswood, hearing the rustle of leaves whisper his name. He dreamed of Ned Stark's voice, calm and steady, telling him about honor. He dreamed of his sister Arya, smiling fiercely, brandishing her little sword, Needle. Then, in the deepest recess of his fever, he heard a different voice, cold and distant. Words from the vow he once spoke. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. The vow stretched out in his mind, each line echoing. In his delirium, he walked in a dark tunnel beneath the wall, hearing those words reverberate off the ice. At the end of the tunnel stood a figure cloaked in red hair, bow in hand, arrow nocked. She drew back the bowstring, but no matter how he tried to speak, he could not. He felt the arrow pierce him again. He jolted awake, gasping for air, half rising from the cot, sweat pouring down his face, pain lancing through his chest. A trembling hand reached for the bandages. The room spun. An unfamiliar steward hurried to press him back down, calling for the maester. Jon's eyes flicked around in confusion, heart pounding as if it might break free of his ribs. Maester Aemon arrived, laying a gentle hand on Jon's brow. The old man's voice was soft and kind. "Easy there," he soothed. "You're safe. You were gravely wounded, but by the gods you held on." Jon's lips were chapped, and he found it difficult to speak. "Ygritte," he croaked, though the word was barely audible. The maester's brow furrowed. "Rest," he said simply, pressing a cup of water to Jon's mouth. Jon drank, coughing. His mind spun, pieces of memory returning in fleeting bursts. The tower, Ygritte, the arrow. He forced himself to remain conscious, despite the throbbing agony in his chest. "Ygritte," he managed again, hoarsely. Maester Aemon's milky eyes flicked to the steward, then back to Jon. "We believe it was she who shot you," he said. "She escaped. Some say she returned to the wildlings, but we do not know." Jon sank back into the pillows, every breath labored. A wave of sorrow gripped him, tears threatening. He closed his eyes, searching his memories, trying to reconcile the image of her trembling hand with the arrow that nearly killed him. He hadn't raised a sword. He had surrendered. Did she truly hate him that much? Or had it been a moment of confusion and anguish that spurred her to loose? His body felt weak, every muscle aching. A dull haze hung over his thoughts. He wanted to speak, but exhaustion dragged him under. He heard the maester telling him to rest. He felt another dose of poppy liquid on his tongue, tasted bitterness, and sank into oblivion again. The maester's care slowly prevailed. Over the following week, Jon's fever receded. He grew strong enough to speak in short bursts, to move his arms without agony, though the wound in his chest remained raw and excruciating. His mind cleared, and he saw the faces of his brothers again. Sam's tearful joy, Ed's grim relief, Gren's awkward smile. Lord Commander Mormont came by as well, giving Jon a nod of approval. "We need you, boy," the old bear muttered, voice rough. "Doubtless the wildlings will come again. Rest as you can, but we'll need every sword when the time comes." Jon managed a nod, though he felt a hollow ache. He knew that conflict loomed, that Mance Rayder would not remain idle forever. But a deeper part of him couldn't stop wondering about Ygritte, about whether she might still be nearby. Despite his near death, he felt an odd gratitude that she hadn't loosed 3 more arrows into him just to be sure. It almost suggested she hadn't truly wanted to kill him. But then, an arrow through the chest spoke for itself. He spent his days convalescing in a small bunk near Maester Aemon's chambers, occasionally mustering the strength to stand and walk a few paces. He refused to let the steward assist him too much, determined to regain some semblance of self-sufficiency. Each step he took was a reminder that he lived, that perhaps he had a greater purpose yet to fulfill. Outside, winter pressed down on the land. Snowstorms raged intermittently. The men of the watch built up the defenses, forging arrowheads, patching the gates. A sense of dread pervaded everything, as if the wall itself could sense the approaching cataclysm. Yet no attack arrived. Sometimes at night, a lone horn blast would sound, only to reveal a stray fox or a trick of the wind. Nerves were fraying. The free folk were out there, hidden, waiting. In the deep hours before dawn on one such night, John managed to slip out of bed without waking the steward who slept nearby. His chest burned, but the pain had lessened. He needed air, needed to see the sky to clear his head. He pulled on his cloak, stepped into his boots, and gingerly made his way outside. Castle Black was quiet, torches guttering on the walls, the vast silhouette of the wall looming overhead. Fresh snow coated the courtyard, crunching softly underfoot. John exhaled, feeling the crisp cold burn his lungs. Each breath reminded him of his injury, but it also reminded him that he was alive. He walked carefully, mindful of his stitches, and found himself gravitating toward that tower, the same one where Ygritte had shot him. He paused at its threshold, pushing open the door, half anticipating some phantom memory. The inside was dark, the ashes of old torches cold. By the faint moonlight shining through the high window, he could see the dried bloodstains on the floor, a dark patch where he had lain. He stared at it, feeling his stomach clench. He knelt with difficulty, resting a hand on the cold stone. This was where it had happened. He could almost see the image. Her face, contorted with anguish, her tear-stained cheeks, the confusion that turned to resolution in the final heartbeat. A swirl of regret, guilt, and longing washed over him. Even now, he did not hate her. He understood the betrayal she must have felt. He only wished she had chosen differently. Standing again took effort, pain spearing through his ribs. He grit his teeth, leaning against the wall for support. A noise behind him made him freeze, a slight scrape of leather on stone. He turned slowly, heart hammering, half expecting a watchman. The shadows in the far corner were deep, swirling in the gloom. No man of the watch stood there. Instead, he saw the faint outline of a small figure. A woman, cloak crusted with frost, that telltale shock of red hair catching a glimmer of moonlight. For a moment, John wondered if he was hallucinating, conjuring her out of grief. But then she stepped forward, and his heart leapt into his throat. "Ygritte," he whispered. She said nothing, bow in hand, but pointed at the floor. She must have slipped inside after him, or perhaps she'd been there first, hidden. The door was still ajar, letting in a faint draft that stirred wisps of her hair. John was too stunned to move. His mind struggled to grasp how she had managed this, how she had gotten past the guards again, how she dared step foot in the place where so many men would kill her on sight. Yet here she was. She lifted her gaze to him, and he saw raw emotions swirling there. Fear, sorrow, relief, anger. "You're alive," she said quietly. It was not a question, more a statement tinged with disbelief. He swallowed, nodding once. "I am." His voice was unsteady, a rush of conflicting emotions making it hard to speak. "You came back." Her lips parted, but no words came. Slowly, she lifted her free hand, as if wanting to reach out but uncertain how. "I had to know," she said at last, voice trembling. "I had to see if you—" She trailed off. John took a tentative step, ignoring the lancing pain in his chest. "You shot me," he said, not accusingly, just stating the fact. "Why come now? You could have." "I know," she cut in, pained. Her hand shook around the bow's grip. "I came to finish it, or, I don't know, Jon Snow. I don't know anything anymore." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I told myself you were dead. I told myself that's what I wanted. But it hasn't felt right since. And She choked on the words, choking on the swirl of grief and longing in her heart. He took another cautious step. She could notch an arrow and kill him in an instant. His hands were empty, no weapon in sight. JHT. His breath was shallow, chest tight. "Don't," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was pleading for her to speak or not to shoot. She dropped her gaze to the floor, tears slipping free. "I can't go back," she whispered. I can't face Mance, can't face Tormund or the others. They'll see your blood on my hands. Call me a crow lover or worse. But I can't stay here either, can't pretend to be one of you. I'm caught in between, and I hate you for it." Her eyes flashed up, that old fire ignited by pain. "I hate you, and I still." Jon's heart thundered, wanting to close the distance, to take her in his arms, to do anything to ease the anguish in her eyes. But he hesitated, remembering the arrow, the betrayal. "Ygritte," he began gently. "What we had. Don't talk about it," she snapped, though her voice was raw with tears. "I just needed to see you with my own eyes. Now I have." He could see she was on the edge, ready to bolt. He stepped forward again, slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. "You can stay," he whispered, words trembling. "We can find a way." She shook her head vehemently. "I'll never wear that black cloak. I'll never bend the knee to your Lord Commander." "You don't have to," he insisted, voice thick with desperation. "There's a bigger threat out there beyond the free folk and the Watch. The White Walkers, the Whites. We're all the living." "I know your talk," she said. "I heard it from you before. But it's your war, not ours." A wave of frustration welled in Jon, mingled with heartbreak. They stood only a few paces apart, both battered by regrets and illusions of what might have been. He thought of how close they'd come to forging a bond that transcended these divisions, how it all fell apart. Outside, the wind howled softly, swirling snow against the tower walls. The silent fortress remained unaware of the bitter confrontation unfolding in the gloom of a forgotten chamber. Jon watched her trembling figure, saw the conflict etched in her features. "You should go," he said finally, voice barely audible. "If anyone finds you here, they'll kill you." He hesitated, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I don't want that." She stared at him through teary eyes. "And if I run, next time we meet?" He closed his eyes. "I'll defend Castle Black," he said quietly, each word a knife to his gut. "We're on opposite sides. That hasn't changed." She took a sharp breath, as if stabbed by the realization. Slowly, she stepped back, never taking her eyes off him. "Goodbye, Jon Snow," she said. He watched in mute pain as she backed out of the doorway, the swirl of snow gusting in for an instant. Then the door shut, and she was gone, leaving him standing there in the moonlit silence, breath ragged, chest aflame. He didn't move for a long time, wrestling with the torment of having her so close, only to lose her again. Part of him wanted to rush after her, but he knew it would be a fool's errand. The guards would be alert, and he was in no shape to give chase. At last, he sank to his knees, pressing a hand to his bandaged chest, feeling the slow throb of his heart. Alive but aching like never before. She had come back, and she had gone. Ygritte slipped through the courtyard shadows, heart pounding, tears freezing to her cheeks. The raging conflict inside her made her every step feel unsteady. Part of her wanted to stay with him, but she couldn't deny her identity, her loyalty to the free folk. She had spilled his blood once. That was a bond of violence that could not simply vanish. Yet love still lingered like a festering wound, refusing to heal. She made her way to a lesser guard tower near the south side of Castle Black, timing her movements with the passing patrols she had observed for nights on end. She used a rope she'd stashed in a narrow crevice, climbing down the rough outer wall. The drop was terrifying, but she was lithe and skilled. Snow cushioned her landing, the cold biting at her limbs. She crouched, scanning the darkness for watchers, then made a swift dash across open ground to the safety of an abandoned storage shack. Once inside, she slipped through a gap in the boards, retrieving a small stash of supplies. Her plan was to flee south, maybe vanish into the mountains, or circle around to rejoin her people if she could face them. She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't linger here. The moment dawn came, Castle Black would search for traces of her again, and this time they might find them. She tasted bitterness on her tongue, cursing fate that had made her cross paths with Jon Snow. Better if he had died on that first climb, or if she had. Better if she never knew the warmth of his arms. Now she was lost, her heart torn, her path broken. Steeling herself, she peered through the shack's warped boards, waiting until the courtyard was empty of patrolling brothers. Then she moved quickly into the swirl of snow, disappearing into the gloom. She slipped through a narrow postern gate, pried open earlier with a small wedge, leaving Castle Black behind for the second time that night. The icy wind greeted her like a scorned lover, lashing her cheeks, urging her onward into the wilderness. She thought of Jon's eyes, his face still drawn with pain, yet filled with longing. The memory twisted inside her. She wished it would vanish, but it remained, etched into her soul, an inescapable truth. She trudged onward, blending into the darkness, a single figure bound by no banner, belonging to no land. The night swallowed her footprints in moments, and all that remained was a whisper of regret carried on the wind. The next morning, the men of the Night's Watch found the rope she had used, the footprints near the gate. Alarm spread. Lord Commander Mormont ordered every corner of Castle Black searched anew, every door inspected. But Ygritte was long gone. Talk of her infiltration reached every brother, fueling suspicion and anger. Some cast wary glances at Jon, remembering rumors of his wildling lover. Others muttered that it might have been a second attempt on his life. Jon, still weak, refused to speak ill of her. When asked, he'd merely say, "She came for her own reasons," and leave it at that. He would not betray her, not further than fate already had. If the men disliked that, he accepted their scorn. He knew the truth was complicated, that Ygritte was not merely an enemy. But the lines drawn at the wall were rarely blurred in the eyes of the Watch. Mormont confronted Jon about the matter, demanding to know if any arrangement had been made, if Ygritte had gleaned secrets or left with knowledge. Jon shook his head. "She came of her own will. She left with nothing from me but regret." The old bear studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing a hand over his grizzled beard. "Very well," he said at last. "Keep your eyes open. This war isn't over." Ygritte ventured deep into the wild, forging a path through frosted hills and pine forests. She avoided other wildlings, half ashamed, half afraid. She hunted alone, ate sparingly, her breath constantly hitching with the memory of Jon's face. Each day was colder than the last, the threat of true winter looming. She told herself she had no place else to go, no future. But she kept walking, day after day, as if searching for something intangible. On a frigid morning, she found herself by a frozen stream, breathing in white clouds, her hands raw from the cold. She saw her reflection in the ice, marred by cracks. A fierce, wounded woman, hair wild, eyes rimmed with tears she refused to shed. She touched the reflection lightly, then rose and continued, leaving the ghost of her sorrow behind. Meanwhile, at Castle Black, Jon Snow resumed duty. He insisted on helping with patrols along the top of the wall, though he could barely climb the stairs without wincing. The wound in his chest remained tender, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. Brothers eyed him warily, but he showed no sign of turning cloak, no sign of reluctance to fight. If anything, his resolve had hardened. Yet each day, he found himself scanning the horizon, a subtle ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the arrow. At night, when he tried to sleep, he dreamt of a cave, a crackling fire, and Ygritte's laughter echoing off the stone. He'd wake with tears in his eyes, forced to swallow them back. In those moments, he recited his vow silently. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins." Each phrase an incantation against the heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm him. He had chosen duty, and he would see it through, though a part of him felt forever torn. If the free folk attacked, would he find her in their ranks? Would he have to raise steel against her, or she another arrow against him? He prayed to the old gods that it would not come to that. Yet in his heart, he suspected that fate was rarely so merciful. Time marched forward. The days blurred under the weight of winter's approach, and the tension along the wall mounted. Scouts reported sightings of giants far to the west. A small band of free folk tested the defenses near the Shadow Tower, prompting a skirmish with minor casualties. The men braced themselves for a full-scale assault that could come at any moment. Jon applied himself diligently. He oversaw archery drills, ensuring that the men had enough arrows, that their aim was true. He inspected the armory, checked the forges, helped plan watch rotations. The old bear commended his dedication. It seemed that near death had tempered Jon's sense of duty into iron. But in the private corners of his mind, Ygritte lingered. Each time he heard a horn in the distance, his heart lurched. Each time scouts reported wildling movement, he wondered if she was among them. Even in his quiet moments, carving meat in the dining hall or gathering tinder, her memory hovered like a phantom, taunting him with what-ifs. Then one afternoon, as men bustled about the courtyard, a raven arrived from Eastwatch with grim tidings. A large force of free folk had been spotted moving toward Castle Black, led by Styr of the Vens. They were moving under cover, but their numbers seemed too great to be a mere raid. They appeared intent on a direct assault, possibly from multiple directions. The alarm spread quickly. Mormont summoned his officers to the map room, where they pored over a tattered chart of the region. The Lord Commander's gruff voice filled the space. "We hold the wall," he declared. "If Styr thinks to overrun us, we'll give him a fight he'll not forget. Jon, you're to lead the archers atop the inner rampart. Gren, Ed, you'll man the catapults. Sam, you stay by the ravens. Send word to the south if we need reinforcements." Jon nodded, though his mind reeled. He tried to keep the memory of Ygritte from overwhelming his focus. This was war now, and he had to be ready. She might be out there, but so might 100, 1,000 others. He could not hesitate. Too many lives depended on his actions. Preparations consumed the rest of the day. Men positioned barrels of oil, sharpened stakes. The gates were reinforced with heavy timbers. Archers checked their bows, readying quivers of arrows. Snow fell thicker as dusk approached, painting the fortress in white. A hush settled over the men, the quiet that comes before a battle. Jon stood on the walkway, cloak wrapped tight, scanning the darkening horizon. Lord Commander Mormont joined him, face grim. "You're certain you're fit for this?" the old bear asked. "That wound." Jon offered a tight nod. "I'll manage, my lord." Mormont grunted, satisfied enough. "Then keep your wits. When the free folk come, they'll try to scale the walls, break down the gates. We hold them off. If they get inside, they'll slaughter us." He clapped Jon on the shoulder, then moved on. Jon exhaled, leaning against the icy parapet. He gazed out into the swirling snow, heart beating hard. In the stillness, memories of Ygritte rose unbidden. She was out there somewhere, a single figure in an army. He tried to imagine her fiery hair amid the ranks, her determined glare. An arrow of pain seared his chest, echoing the wound that nearly killed him. "All for duty," he murmured to himself, as if trying to steel his resolve. Night fell fully, a moonless void draping the land in darkness. Torches flared along the wall. Shadows stretched across the yard. The men of the Night's Watch kept silent vigil, ears straining for any sign of the oncoming attack. Snow continued to drift, muffling the world in a veil of white. Then, some time past midnight, the horns sounded 3 blasts, echoing across the ice. "Enemies at the gates!" a watchman cried. Shouts rose, weapons clanged. Men scrambled into position. Torches swayed, casting frenetic patterns of light and shadow. Jon rushed to rally the archers, ignoring the flare of pain in his chest. From the top of the wall, a watchman hollered that shapes were moving at the tree line, dark forms trudging through the snow. Another pointed out movement along a rocky outcrop. It seemed the free folk were approaching from multiple sides, testing the fortress for weakness. The men knocked arrows, breath steaming in the cold, hearts pounding. A solitary horn blast rumbled from the distance. Then a blood-curdling chorus of war cries erupted. The free folk charged. Thens, dressed in heavy leathers and bone armor, howled like beasts. A scattering of wildling clans accompanied them, brandishing axes, spears, and crude shields. Some carried grappling hooks, ropes, even tall ladders. Giants, bigger than men could imagine, lumbered behind them, harnessed to massive logs intended to batter gates. The air filled with the shrill whistle of arrows as Jon gave the command. Brothers let fly, black shafts arcing through the swirling snow. The front ranks of the free folk stumbled, riddled with arrows. Screams cut the night, but more rushed forward, stepping over the fallen. A then chieftain bellowed, and a wave of warriors hurled throwing axes at the parapets. Jon ducked, a thunk sounding near his shoulder. He saw a brother beside him topple back, an axe embedded in his chest. Gritting his teeth, Jon knocked another arrow and loosed, striking a wildling who was about to throw a grapple. Another brother poured boiling oil from a cauldron over the rampart, shrieks erupting below. The stench of burning flesh rose, nausea coiling in Jon's gut. In the chaotic flicker of torchlight, the free folk reached the walls, slamming grappling hooks into the stone, attempting to climb. A few set ladders, though the defenders shoved them away. Still, bodies piled as the onslaught intensified. Above, catapults launched stones and crude fire bombs, lighting the night with bursts of flame. Jon shouted orders, his voice nearly lost amid the din. He felt the old instincts of battle well up, pushing aside fear, pushing aside every thought except survival and duty. He knocked arrow after arrow, loosing them at the climbing shapes. Once, in the fleeting illumination of a blazing torch, he thought he saw a flash of red hair among the throng below. His chest twisted, but the moment passed. The defenders held for a time. Then a horn blast from the southern side signaled another wave. Jon's head snapped that way. Shouts rose, distant but urgent, indicating a breach near a side gate. The night's watch was spread thin. Mormont had to send men rushing to reinforce. Jon glanced at the archers around him, then at the unstoppable mass below. He realized with horror that the attackers were coordinating, drawing the watch away from the main gate. In the distance, he spotted a giant hauling a massive battering ram. The men at the gate readied to pour oil, but the giant's hide was thick, and the then warriors near it bore large shields. Step by step they advanced. Jon's throat went dry. He bellowed for more archers to focus on the giant. Arrows pelted its torso and arms, some bouncing off, some piercing. The beast roared, stumbling. A volley struck its eyes and neck, causing it to thrash violently, crushing wildlings near it. But more giants followed. Amid the frenzy, Jon found himself scanning faces in the crowd below, searching for that shock of red. He loosed another arrow, downing a wildling who nearly reached the top of the wall. The man's scream echoed as he plummeted. Jon forced himself to keep firing, ignoring the moral weight pressing on him. This was war. Suddenly, a brutal impact shook the rampart. A piece of siege equipment, some kind of crude catapult, had lobbed a massive stone, striking the wall's edge. Brothers were knocked off their feet. Jon staggered back, losing hold of his bow, clattered away, falling down the steps behind him. "Fall back!" someone yelled. Another volley of rocks slammed into the ramparts, sending shards of ice and stone flying. Jon coughed, scrambling to find a stable footing. Across the courtyard, he saw men rallying around Mormont, trying to repel a breach. With no bow in hand, Jon drew Longclaw, ignoring the pain that flared in his chest. He rushed along the parapet to where a trio of wildlings had gained a foothold at the top. The first swung a rusty axe at him. Jon parried, the clash ringing in the night. He twisted, driving the pommel into the wildling's jaw, sending him staggering. Another lunged with a spear. Jon sidestepped, slashing across the man's torso, blood spraying. All around, screams and clanging steel. Another stone crashed into the wall, sending men tumbling in a shower of ice. Jon coughed through the swirl of debris, scanning the battlements. He saw Ed and Gren fighting side by side, holding a section of the rampart. Further down, a then crushed a watch recruit's skull with a warhammer before being skewered by a crossbow bolt. Amid the chaos, a savage cry rang out, and Jon saw a wildling with braided hair and tattoos scaling the wall with terrifying speed, brandishing twin daggers. Jon rushed to intercept, gritting his teeth against the ache in his chest. Their blades clashed, dancing in the flickering light. Each impact jarred Jon's torso, sending waves of agony through his wound. But he fought on, blocking an overhead slash, pivoting to deliver a killing thrust. The wildling fell away, face locked in a death grimace. Jon stood there, breathing heavily, sweat and blood mingling on his brow. He wiped a streak of grime from his cheek, senses blazing. In that moment he heard her voice, a shout from somewhere in the courtyard below. "For the free folk!" He spun, chest pounding. There, in the confusion, was Ygritte. She stood with a small group of wildlings who had broken through one of the lesser gates, all brandishing weapons. Her bow was in her hands, arrow nocked. Their eyes locked across the distance, heartbreak mingling with the frenzy of battle. She saw him standing on the rampart, sword drawn. He saw her, hair blazing in torchlight. For a single heartbeat, time seemed to slow. Each remembered the cave, the tenderness of shared warmth, the moment she shot him in the tower, the meeting in the gloom, the near kiss that never happened. Then reality surged back. A wildling beside her bellowed and charged deeper into the courtyard, and Ygritte followed, arrow at the ready. Jon lost sight of her behind the fortress structures and the swirling mass of bodies. Desperation fueled him. He dashed toward the stairs, determined to reach her before it was too late. Men cried out around him, locked in brutal combat. He vaulted over a fallen brother, wincing as pain lanced through his wound. Down the steps he went, nearly slipping on blood-slick ice. Another crash shook the courtyard as a part of the outer palisade gave way under giant-fueled rams. Everywhere was chaos. Watch brothers fought wildlings in fierce pockets of violence. Bodies littered the ground, blood staining the snow. Torches cast a hellish glow, smoke curling into the stormy sky. Jon pushed through, shouting for Ygritte, though his voice was swallowed by the din. He parried a spear thrust, spun away from a swinging mace. A savage thrust from Longclaw dropped another wildling. The courtyard stank of fear and death. He spotted Ygritte's red hair for a moment, glimpsed her drawing back an arrow and loosing it into a guard who fell with a scream. Then she vanished behind a fallen timber. Jon followed, heart pounding. He found her crouched beside a shattered cart, breathing hard. A gash on her forehead trickled blood. She saw him and froze, arrow half-knocked. Their eyes locked. They were alone in that moment, the rest of the battle a blur of noise beyond them. Each raised a weapon, uncertain whether to strike or to speak. Jon's voice came first, raw. "Ygritte, please." She trembled, tears mixing with blood and sweat. "We're at war, Jon Snow," she said, voice breaking. "We're on opposite sides." He shook his head, stepping closer, though he kept his sword lowered. "It doesn't have to be like this." She laughed bitterly, tears in her eyes. "Yes, it does." Her arrow aimed at his chest, exactly where the scar lay beneath his leathers. A tear slipped down her cheek. "You left me once. I shot you for it. Now look at us. Look at what we've become." Jon opened his mouth to protest, but an explosion of noise cut him off. A section of the gate behind them collapsed under giant assault. Screams tore the air. Dozens of wildlings poured in. The courtyard became a roiling sea of violence. Ygritte glanced over her shoulder, then back at Jon, torn between duty to her people and the pang in her heart. A then warrior charged around the debris, brandishing a massive axe. He lunged at Ygritte, not recognizing her as an ally in the chaos or not caring. She spun aside, releasing an arrow into his throat. He fell, gurgling. Jon used the distraction to step closer, sword at the ready. "Come with me," he shouted over the din. "We can still." She cut him off, eyes burning. "I belong with my people. You belong here." Her arrow still hovered near his chest. For a heartbeat, he thought she might let the bowstring slacken, that she might choose some path of peace. Then a snarl from behind him drew his attention. Another wildling leapt over the wreckage, brandishing a sword at Jon's back. Jon twisted, barely blocking in time, steel ringing. The impact sent a flare of agony through his torso. he gasped, forced to defend himself. Ygritte stepped back, arrow knocked, but she didn't loose, perhaps afraid of hitting Jon. Jon dispatched the wildling with a desperate slash. Blood splashed, and the man collapsed. But in that instant, he lost sight of Ygritte. When he turned, she was gone again, vanished into the melee. "Ygritte!" he shouted, voice hoarse, but no reply came. Another wave of wildlings spilled in, forcing Jon to defend himself. He fought with grim determination, each kill feeling like a weight on his soul. Hours seemed to pass in the chaotic churn of combat, though it might have been mere minutes. Eventually, reinforcements from the Watch and the arrival of rangers who had been out on patrol helped turn the tide. Giants fell under concentrated arrow fire. The gates were partially stabilized. The free folk, seeing their assault falter, began to retreat, gathering their wounded. Horn blasts signaled the fallback. One by one, the wildlings pulled away, leaving broken timbers and bloody corpses behind. When the last of them vanished into the dark, a ragged cheer went up from the surviving brothers. Victory, if one could call it that. The courtyard lay strewn with bodies. Men of the Watch, wildlings, even a few half-burned giants. Smoke clung to the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Jon stood amid the carnage, panting, Longclaw dripping red. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Pain throbbed in his chest, fresh blood seeping through his bandages. His eyes darted across the bodies, searching for any sign of a slender form with fiery hair. A part of him dreaded finding her there. Another part dreaded not finding her. He moved among the fallen, heart heavy, stepping over the wounded and the dead. He saw men moaning in agony, some beyond any help. The stench of death clung to everything. After endless searching, he found no trace of Ygritte. She wasn't among the dead, not in the courtyard or the side passages. If she was wounded, perhaps her people carried her away, or perhaps she escaped on her own. In either case, she was gone. Jon sank to his knees, the cold seeping through his clothes, mingling with the warm blood on the stones. He felt tears threaten, mixing grief for his fallen brothers with the heartbreak of losing her once again. He bowed his head, letting out a shuddering breath. All around him, the men of the Night's Watch set about tending to the wounded, dragging corpses into piles. The wails of the dying filled the night, echoing across the shattered courtyard. Victory had come at a terrible cost. Lord Commander Mormont eventually arrived, surveying the devastation with grim eyes. He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "We've won the night," he said, voice hollow. "But the war goes on. Get yourself seen by the maester, boy. We'll need you if they come again." Jon numbly rose, leaning on Longclaw like a crutch. He could scarcely feel his legs. As he limped away, he looked back one last time, a flicker of hope that Ygritte might emerge from some corner of the wreckage. But there was only darkness and death. Far beyond the walls, through snow-laden forests and treacherous paths, the free folk gathered what was left of their raiding party. Fires burned low as they nursed their wounded, curses thrown at the then leaders who had bungled the assault. Ygritte sat apart from the others, crouched near a ragged pine, an arrow wound in her shoulder. She winced as she tried to remove the broken shaft, biting back a cry of pain. A wildling approached to help, but she waved him off. She snapped the arrow near the tip, then pulled the rest free with a grunt, blood staining her sleeve. Tears stung her eyes, not just from pain, but from everything. She recalled the moment she faced Jon in the courtyard, the tears on his face, the anguish in his voice. Once more, she had raised a weapon against him. She loosed arrows into his brothers without hesitation, fulfilling her duty. But when she saw him, she couldn't do it again. She had cursed the gods for putting them on opposite sides. Now she huddled there, wounded in body and spirit, alone even among her people. She didn't know if Jon lived or died in the aftermath. If he died, she had lost him all over again. If he lived, they were doomed to clash once more. She hated the conflict inside her, hated the war that made enemies of them. Yet she could no more abandon her people than he could abandon his oath. A bitter wind scoured the camp, rattling branches overhead. She bowed her head, pressing a hand to her wound, feeling hot blood slick her fingers. In her mind, she saw Jon's face once more, and a sob tore from her throat, silent and desperate. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness cradle her. The following weeks brought only more strife. Mance Rayder continued his efforts to breach the wall, though with each failed raid, the free folks' numbers dwindled. The Night's Watch held firm, though at great cost. Every victory was Pyrrhic, every day a testament to endurance over despair. Jon recovered as best he could, his chest wound scarred, a reminder of Ygritte's arrow. He rose to new responsibilities, helping strategize with Mormont, training fresh recruits, and seeing to supply lines. All the while, he kept a silent vigil, hoping not to see her face among the dead, hoping somehow they could both survive this madness. Sometimes at night, he would climb the wall and stare northward, imagining he might see her, a lone figure wandering beneath the moonlight. He wondered if she hated him still, or if any love remained. He wondered if there was a day in some distant future where they could share peace. But each dawn reminded him of reality. Two worlds at war, two hearts that once dared to find a brief sanctuary in a cave, only to be shattered by oaths and loyalties. So the winter deepened, and the war dragged on. The free folk marched, the watch defended. Blood stained the snow, freezing under a pitiless sky, and somewhere in that vast, cold land, Ygritte roamed, neither a crow nor a spear wife with a clear path, haunted by the man she both loved and nearly killed. Their story had no resolution, only the promise of more battles, more heartbreak. Yet in the quiet moments, when the wind died and the stars shimmered overhead, each remembered the warmth that once wrapped them in a cave's darkness. Each felt the ache of that memory, the possibility of what might have been if only the wall between them did not exist. In the end, the wall remained, a barrier of ice, just as real as the walls they had built around their hearts. The nights were long and cold, and the war was far from over. But in that silent tension, in that unyielding conflict, a small ember of longing refused to die. Perhaps that ember would burn them both in time, or perhaps it would guide them toward something neither could yet imagine. For now, all that remained was the snow and the ice, the vow and the arrow, the broken hearts that beat on either side of the wall. And though the night was dark and full of terrors, somewhere, in the hush between each breath, lingered a whisper of love, lost, but never truly extinguished. A bitter wind blew over the corpse-littered courtyard of Castle Black, carrying the sense of smoke and blood into the yawning darkness beyond the wall. Under a sallow moon, the surviving men of the Night's Watch moved among the dead, searching for any sign of lingering life. A few carried flickering torches, the flames guttering in the sharp gusts. Others dragged bodies, brothers and wildlings alike, into makeshift rows, so the fallen could be tended to or burned, depending on where their loyalties had once lain. The task was grim, yet it had become all too familiar in recent days. Jon Snow stood at the edge of the courtyard, Longclaw gripped loosely in his gloved hand, its Valyrian steel caked with half-frozen gore. Every muscle in his body ached from the night's violent exertion, and the half-healed wound in his chest throbbed with each shallow breath. He felt as if he balanced on a precipice between collapse and duty, kept upright by sheer force of will. Blood had seeped through his bandages, stiffening the layers beneath his black cloak, but the cold numbed some of the pain. His gaze swept across the bodies in the snow, searching one last time for any sign of the fiery hair that haunted his thoughts. But Ygritte was not among the dead. In truth, he did not know whether that absence was a blessing or an unending torment. If she had escaped, she could return to war against him again. If she lay hidden beneath some tangle of limbs, the thought of it twisted his gut into knots. Still, no matter how many times he forced himself to look, he did not see her. A few yards away, Lord Commander Mormont stood conferring with a cluster of officers who'd survived the onslaught. His usually gruff features were streaked with soot, and his gaze was weary. As Jon approached, Mormont's sharp eyes flicked to him. Despite his battered appearance, the old bear's presence remained formidable. a man who'd witnessed too much death in his life, yet had to remain the anchor that held the night's watch together. How bad? John asked quietly, swallowing against a dry throat. Mormont's face hardened. We lost nearly a score of men in this assault alone, wounded at least as many. That's atop the casualties from last month's raid. Those free folk are wearing us down bit by bit. John nodded, the exhaustion in his limbs intensifying at the tally of the dead. Will they come again soon? One of the officers, a rangy man named Mullen, spoke up, voice husky with fatigue. We caught a few wildlings who were too injured to flee. From what they're babbling, this was a push by steer to see if our gates were weakened in the last storm. They didn't intend a full siege tonight. Maybe they tested the waters for manse. Mullen spat on the snow. We gave 'em a warm welcome, though. Mormont grunted in acknowledgement. For now, we'll reinforce the gates, see to the wounded, and keep the wall manned. If the free folk are regrouping, we might get a day or two before they strike again. After that, I can't say. His gaze fell on John. You look half dead yourself, Snow. Get that wound tended. I need you upright. John inclined his head. Yes, my lord. He wanted to protest that he could continue without rest, but a wave of dizziness made him realize how close to collapse he truly was. Go on. Mormont's expression softened the tiniest fraction. We'll clean up here. Well fought, boy. John dragged his feet back toward Maester Eamon's chambers, forcing himself not to glance again at the lines of corpses. He had done that grim survey enough times to know she wasn't there. Even so, the question remained. If she lived, where had she gone? And when would she strike next? He found Samwell Tarley waiting in the arched doorway of the infirmary. Sam's broad face was ashen with shock, and flecks of dried blood speckled his cloak, likely from carrying wounded men. When he saw John, his eyes widened in relief. John, you're alive, Sam breathed, stepping forward as if to catch John should he stumble. I heard you were in the thick of it again. John managed a thin smile, though it felt hollow. I'm all right, or near enough. How are the wounded? There are so many, Sam said, voice trembling with sorrow. Maester Eamon is working himself ragged trying to help them. Some won't last the night. Gren's got a nasty gash on his arm, but he'll live. Ed's better off, only bruised ribs. PYP didn't come back. They found him near the base of the wall. An arrow to the neck. A knot formed in John's throat. Another friend gone. Lost in the avalanche of war that had become their new normal. The flicker of guilt nipped at him, though he knew that in such chaos, blame was a futile concept. I'm sorry, he murmured. I'll look in on them, see if there's anything I can do. Sam nodded, though his gaze lingered on John's chest. At least let Maester Eamon change your bandages. You're bleeding through them again. John glanced down to see the dark patch where blood had soaked his shirt. Yes, he said quietly, allowing Sam to guide him inside. In the cramped infirmary, the air was thick with the stench of sweat, poultices, and pain. Cots lined the walls, each occupied by a wounded brother, some moaning, others lying eerily still. Maester Eamon, frail and bent by age, hovered over one with a mortar and pestle, his blind eyes somehow scanning the room with uncanny awareness. He turned toward John, hearing his approach, and motioned for him to sit. Back again, John, Eamon said softly, setting aside the mortar. Let's see how badly you've taxed your recovery this time. John pulled off his cloak and unbuckled his jerkin. Eamon's steward, Clydas, helped remove the layers carefully, revealing the blood-soaked bandages over John's old arrow wound. The fresh strain of battle had reopened the scarring flesh. Eamon's touch was gentle but precise as he peeled the bandages away, applying a new salve that stung fiercely. Too much strain, the maester murmured. I warned you that wound was not fully mended, and now it's torn again. John winced but bore it. We had no choice, maester. They breached the courtyard. I understand, Eamon said kindly. War does not wait for men to heal, but if you push your body too far, you'll find yourself one step from the grave. Rest is essential. The old man's tone allowed no argument. Once Eamon was satisfied with the cleaning and rebandaging, he pressed a cup of willow bark tea into John's hands. "Drink. You'll need it to calm the pain." John complied, ignoring the bitter taste. His gaze moved around the infirmary, settling on the faces of men he knew, stewards, rangers, even some recruits who had only recently taken the black. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the flicker of hopelessness. How much longer could they stand? After Maester Eamon finished, Sam approached hesitantly. "Do you want to lie down? Get some sleep." John shook his head, setting the empty cup aside. "I'll rest soon. First, I need to speak with Mormont about our next steps. If the free folk attacked this viciously, they might be preparing for a second wave. We need to set watches, resupply the men, and—" Sam cut him off, face filled with worry. "John, the Lord Commander can manage for a while without you. He'll want you alive for the real fight." John stared at Sam, wanting to protest but finding no energy left for debate. In the end, he nodded wearily. "I'll lie down for a bit. Let me know if the Lord Commander calls for me." Sam exhaled in relief. He guided John to a vacant cot. Though the bedroll was thin and scratchy, to John it felt like the softest pillow of Winterfell. He let out a slow breath, the pains in his chest easing slightly. Within moments, exhaustion overcame him, dragging him into a deep, dreamless slumber. Outside, a new snow began to fall, covering the bloodstains of the courtyard. Men still toiled by torchlight, building fires, burning the bodies of the wildlings. The bodies of fallen brothers would be tended with greater care, a pyre or a solemn burial, depending on the old bear's orders. Grief and exhaustion weighed on them all, but the job had to be done. The wall loomed overhead, silent witness to the endless cycle of conflict. Ygritte winced as she poured stream water over her wound, washing away dried blood and crusted mud. The arrow she'd taken in her shoulder earlier in the night, a stray from one of her own side, or possibly friendly fire, still burned like a brand. She had snapped the shaft off during the initial retreat, leaving the arrowhead lodged in the muscle. There had been no time or skill enough to remove it properly in the heat of the fallback. Now, in a small copse of pines far from Castle Black, she tried to tend it herself with numb fingers and gritted teeth. The free folks' makeshift camp was spread out around her, hidden among dense pines. Cooking fires glowed dimly, and the murmur of pained voices seeped into the night. Styr's raid had failed. The cost had been steep in dead and wounded. Though they had inflicted damage on the Night's Watch, they had not breached the fortress in any meaningful way. She thought of the carnage in the courtyard, the swirling chaos. She could still see it whenever she closed her eyes. The swirl of black cloaks, the ring of steel, and Jon Snow, his face streaked with sweat and blood, eyes wide with mingled relief and heartbreak the moment their gazes had met. Even now, she felt the memory throbbing beneath her breastbone, a torment that refused to fade. She had been ready to loose an arrow at him again, she told herself, but each time the moment arrived, she found her hands trembling, her vision blurred by something that felt too close to grief. She hated him, she loved him, she despised that she could not let go. She had shot him once. If she truly meant to kill him, she could have drawn that bow a second time, yet she never loosed the arrow. Part of her still burned with fury over his betrayal. Part of her ached with the memory of High's arms around her in that cave. As she struggled to wash her wound, her friend and fellow spearwife, Valina, approached. Valina was tall and sinewy, her dark hair braided tight against her skull. She carried a crude clay pot of hot water, kneeling beside Ygritte with concern etched into her face. "Let me see," Valina murmured. She took a small bone-handled knife and gestured for Ygritte to brace herself. With a swift movement, she cut away more of the ragged cloth around Ygritte's shoulder, exposing the swollen, red flesh. "You're lucky," Valina said, voice tight. "It doesn't look too deep, but that arrowhead. Just do it," Ygritte hissed, setting her jaw. She refused to show more weakness than necessary. Valina nodded, pressing a hand to Ygritte's good shoulder. Then she took a breath and used the tip of the knife to probe gently for the embedded arrowhead. Ygritte clenched her teeth, stifling a groan as white-hot agony sparked through her nerves. Slowly, Valina worked the shard free and dropped it in the snow, where it sizzled faintly from the heat of fresh blood. She then washed the wound with the hot water, ignoring Ygritte's gasps of pain. When it was done, Ygritte's forehead was damp with sweat, and her hands trembled. She was breathing heavily, her teeth clenched so tightly that pain radiated up through her jaw. Valina spread a pungent herbal paste on the wound, one of the free folk's traditional remedies. It might reduce the risk of infection if luck held. Then she wrapped it with a strip of linen, tying it off gently. "Better," Valina said, wiping her own brow. "Give it time. You'll need rest, though. You can't keep fighting like this." Ygritte gave a shaky nod, though she was not one to admit any weakness. Her gaze flicked around the camp. Huddled figures tended to their own hurts: burns, frostbite, arrow wounds. Others lay silent, past the point of healing. She recognized fewer faces than usual. Many friends had fallen or scattered. Some had deserted, perhaps, or died in the snow. The disheartening truth pressed down on her. They were losing, slowly but surely, battered by every failed attempt to breach the wall. "When do we move again?" Ygritte asked, voice hoarse. Valina shrugged. "Depends on the thens. They lost many men tonight, and some of their leaders are quarreling with Tormund's bunch. Styr is dead. One of the crow's catapults crushed him. The thens are furious and want revenge, but it's a mess. Mance might be sending word soon. We're supposed to regroup with the main host, or so they say." "Mance," Ygritte muttered. "He's still waiting for a sign that we can break the crows." "That's the rumor," Valina said, her lips twisting grimly. "He's got the giants, the mammoths, more clans gathering. But the Watch has an advantage behind those walls, and that huge chunk of ice. The more we try to climb or batter it, the more of us die." Ygritte lowered her gaze, thinking of how she had once climbed the wall with Jon, how their hearts had pounded in unison when they finally reached the top. For a moment, the memory heated her chest, battling the numbing cold of the night. Now that memory felt half a dream, belonging to a different life. "We'll see what Mance does," she said at last. "We'll do what we must." Her tone sounded hollow to her own ears, but she forced herself to appear resolute. The free folk had to stand together after all, or they would surely perish. Valina studied her a moment, as if sensing Ygritte's internal turmoil, but she said nothing. Instead, she rose, dusting snow from her furs. "Try to rest," she advised. "I'll bring you food if we can spare any." Ygritte nodded, feeling the weariness seep into her bones. Every breath was painful. She cradled her freshly bandaged shoulder and leaned against a tree trunk, gaze drifting over the quiet gloom. Part of her mind wandered toward Jon Snow, wondering if he was alive or dead, wounded or unscathed. She loathed that she cared, and loathed even more that her heart twisted at the thought of his face, so battered and sorrowful. Eventually, fatigue claimed her. The cold night seemed infinite, but she drifted into a fitful rest. In her dreams, she saw a cave lit by torchlight, the warmth of a hot spring reflecting off the damp walls. There, Jon Snow laughed, free of worry, and she was in his arms. But when she tried to speak, blood trickled from his lips, and an arrow jutted from his chest. She woke with a start, biting back a cry that died in her throat. The dream left her shaken, resentful, and more alone than ever. When Jon awoke the next day, it was to the dull roar of men's voices and the clang of the castle's morning routine. His chest wound ached fiercely, but the bandages held. He rose from the cot, blinking in the watery daylight that came through a thin window slit. He found the hallway beyond the infirmary swarming with activity. Stewards rushing about, rangers returning from short-range patrols, the occasional raven hand sprinting with messages. Soot smeared many faces, and no one looked well-rested. The wear of constant vigilance had carved shadows beneath every pair of eyes. Dolorous Ed intercepted Jon near the stairs. "Lord Commander wants you," Ed said, his voice as somber as ever. Meeting in the map room. He's calling in all officers and senior rangers who can walk. John gave a curt nod. Any new developments? Ed grimaced. The free folk have pulled back for now, but a scouting party saw them regrouping near the foothills. Rumor says there's a bigger force heading this way, led by Mance Raider himself. At that, John's heart tightened. Mance bringing his main host meant the situation had truly escalated. If Mance attacked in earnest, the Watch might be facing tens of thousands of wildlings, giants, mammoths, and every clan from the frozen shore to the far north. They were outnumbered by a vast margin. The only advantage lay in the wall itself and the fortress design. John hurried to the map room, ignoring the pain in his chest. There, he found Mormont standing over a table strewn with charts, along with several other senior members of the Watch. Ser Jeremy Ricker, Bowen Marsh, Othel Yarwick, and a few more. Their expressions were grave. Mormont acknowledged John with a nod. "Good, you're here. Close the door." John obeyed, stepping inside. The air in the room was cold, despite the brazier lit in the corner. A stale tension settled around them. Mormont braced both hands on the table, exhaling. "We've had word from our rangers. Mance is indeed on the move. He's massing his largest host yet, likely to march on us before the fortnight is out." A murmur ran through the gathered men. Bowen Marsh's lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't repel an army that sighs on every side of the wall." Mormont's gaze swept the group. "We'll do what we've always done. Fortify Castle Black, man the other strong points as best we can, and rely on the wall's defenses. We have no reinforcements from the south. None we can count on, at least. Winterfell is embroiled in the War of the Five Kings, and the rest of Westeros has its own problems. We stand alone." A heavy silence followed. Finally, Othel Yarwick cleared his throat. "The big question. How long can we hold out with our men so few?" "As long as needed," Mormont growled. "There's no alternative. If Mance gets through us, it's the realm he'll march on next, and the realm has no idea what's coming." John swallowed. "We need to make every arrow count, every stone, every drop of oil. We can't afford to lose a single man to foolishness." Bowen Marsh gave John a sharp look. "And how do we keep them from climbing over or under the wall in a dozen places we can't fully watch? You know how cunning the free folk can be. How cunning that lover of yours was." John tensed but held Marsh's gaze. He refused to rise to the bait. "We do our best. Patrols must keep an eye on the forest approach. If they try to climb, we'll have rangers on rope ladders patrolling the top, ready to cut them down. If they bring giants and rams to the gates, we focus every catapult and oil barrel on those points. We hold the choke. If they spread out to climb, we hope our scouts spot them in time." Mormont nodded slowly, though his expression remained grim. "We'll do exactly that. Yarwick, see that the outer gates are double-braced with new timber. Marsh, handle the supply inventory. I want a count of every arrow, every bit of steel we have left. John, you'll coordinate the archers. We'll break them into rotating shifts so we always have fresh eyes." "What about me?" Ser Jeremy Ricker asked. "You'll oversee the catapults," Mormont said, turning to him. "We have two that still function well. If there's a chance to strike at the giants, do it. But be ready for the free folk to try sabotage. They like small infiltration teams, spears, climbers. Don't let them reach the mechanics." "Aye, my lord," Ricker acknowledged. Mormont cast his gaze over each man in turn. "We'll plan to strengthen the interior courtyard as well. If they breach the main gate, we'll have to fall back to the second ring, fighting corridor by corridor. We hold, no matter what." A hush followed, each man parsing the gravity of those words. Finally, Mormont gave a weary wave of his hand. "That's all. Go about your tasks. And remember, the Night's Watch stands, or Westeros falls. Dismissed." Over the next 3 days, Castle Black became a hive of frantic preparation. Men hammered planks into place, hoisted barrels of oil up onto parapets, tested ropes, scouted the area beyond the wall. Ravens flew to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, bearing pleas for help or at least warnings of Mance's approach. Some returned empty, others never came back at all. Jon found himself at the center of the fortress's defenses, coordinating the archers with single-minded resolve. He painstakingly inspected each bow, ensuring the strings were strong and the arrows well-fletched. He organized the men into overlapping shifts, so fresh archers would be on rotation day and night, ready to rain death on any assault. If Mance's horde arrived in the middle of the night, they would be prepared. His wound throbbed, but he refused to let it slow him. Pain served as a reminder of Ygritte, of the precarious line he walked between love and loyalty. He forced himself not to dwell on her, burying those thoughts beneath the weight of duty. If the moment came and he saw her among the attackers, he would do what had to be done, or so he told himself. Occasionally, Sam tried to pull Jon aside to insist he rest. Jon would spare a few hours of sleep, then return to the ramparts, eyes scanning the horizon for any trace of movement. He barely noticed time passing. Between the brutality of the war already fought and the dread of the war to come, life narrowed to survival and vigilance. On the third afternoon, a runner arrived, breathless, shouting about smoke signals spotted beyond the tree line. Jon rushed to a vantage point with a handful of other rangers. Through the crisp air, he could see thin plumes of smoke rising against the pale sky, far off in the direction of the Frostfangs. "That's them," muttered Dolorous Ed, standing at Jon's side. "One signal for each clan, or so they say. Soon we'll see them march." Jon nodded grimly. "We'll be ready." They set watchers along the top of the wall, men whose eyesight was keen enough to pick out details from a great distance. Whenever the watchers saw shapes moving en masse, they sounded the horn. By sunset, those shapes had begun to emerge, hundreds, then thousands, a dark line cutting through the snow. They were still miles away, but the sight was ominous. At dinner, a somber hush prevailed in the mess hall. The usual banter was gone, replaced by the quiet clink of spoons against bowls and the shifting of uneasy men on benches. Everyone knew that this might be their last night before a full-scale siege. Jon barely touched his food, lost in thought. Ghost, his pale direwolf, padded up silently to press a cold nose against Jon's leg. The wolf had avoided large crowds of men after the fighting intensified, but he never strayed far from Jon, as if sensing the mounting peril. Absently, Jon scratched Ghost's ears. The wolf's presence offered a small comfort, a reminder of Winterfell and the Stark family that had once been his home, before duty claimed him. By the time night fell, the tension in Castle Black was palpable enough to make even the torch flames seem to quiver. Snow blew in fitful gusts, and the temperature plummeted. Every man layered himself in furs, gloved his hands, and huddled near braziers as they waited for the horns to sound. For a time, the darkness remained still. Then, not long before midnight, the watchers on the wall cried out. Horn blasts echoed through the fortress. 1, 2, 3. The thunderous sound rolled off the ice, sending a jolt through every soul in Castle Black. Men rushed to their posts, adrenaline surging. Jon climbed the long stair to the top of the wall, ignoring the agony in his chest. Wind whipped his cloak, and swirling snow limited visibility. Still, by torchlight, he could see the ominous glow of distant fires moving across the plain. Mance's army was on the march. He reached the parapets, where a line of archers awaited. Behind them, men stood ready with barrels of oil and catapults set on wooden sledges. Dolorous Ed, Gren, bandaged but determined, Ser Jeremy Ricker, and others braced themselves against the biting wind. The entire top of the wall was alive with grim-faced watchers, each scanning the sea of darkness below. At first, the approach of Mance's host was little more than a shifting gloom punctuated by torches. Slowly, it resolved into countless figures. The watchers counted not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands. Wildlings, horsemen, mammoths dragging war machines, lines of giants in the rearguard. It was a vast wave of humanity and more, advancing under the cover of night. Jon felt a tightness in his chest that had little to do with the wound. He knew Mance Rayder was cunning and had rallied nearly every free folk clan under one banner, all desperate to cross south before the worst of winter, and worse threats descended upon them. If they couldn't break through the wall, they might all perish when the deep snows came and the White Walkers emerged. The free folk felt they had no choice. The Night's Watch, bound by oath, had to stop them. A horn from below signaled that the men in the courtyard stood ready. Lord Commander Mormont's silhouette was visible on the walkway, commanding the ground defenses. Jon's role was up here. He steadied himself, turning to the archers. "Hold until they're in range," he commanded, his voice carrying over the wind. "Make every shot count. Aim for the giants first if you can. If they bring up ladders or grapnels, we cut them down." The men nodded, grimly determined. As the horde drew closer, the clamor of their march reached the top of the wall. A low rumble punctuated by the calls of horns, the roar of mammoths, the guttural shouts of thousands of wildlings. Snow churned under their feet, swirling into a chaotic mass. Torches bobbed like angry fireflies. Finally, when they were near enough that the watchers could distinguish figures rushing forward, Jon gave the order, "Loose!" A flurry of arrows arced out, disappearing into the dark below. Moments later came screams and cries of pain. The wildlings, hearing the twang of bows, began to spread out, raising crude shields, trying to minimize casualties. More horns sounded. Giants lumbered forward, dragging massive logs to ram or climb. Another volley followed, then another. The hiss of arrows through the freezing air became a relentless chorus. Down below, the free folk responded with their own arrow fire, though their range was limited. Now and then, a black-fletched arrow soared up, only to clatter harmlessly against the wall or drop short. A few found unlucky watchers exposed on the parapet. Jon heard men cry out, saw shapes crumple backward, toppling off the walkway. "Keep firing!" Jon shouted, loosing arrow after arrow, though each pull of the bow reminded him of the tear in his chest. The old wound's ache was a white-hot line. He ignored it. The men around him did the same, focusing on their targets. Below, huge shapes began lumbering closer. Mammoths hauling siege towers and battered wagons that had been converted into rolling platforms. The free folk were trying every tactic possible. In the chaos, a group of wildlings sprinted forward with grappling hooks, flinging them onto the ice. Jon directed archers to target those climbers, sending them tumbling down before they found purchase. More roars echoed as giants roped themselves to the gates at the base of the wall, trying to pull them loose. A bellowed command rose from the bottom. Torches swarmed, and a giant war-horn blast reverberated up the wall. Jon peered over, squinting through the swirling snow and the flashes of firelight. That was when he saw a large contingent of wildlings veering toward the left flank, trying to find a weaker section. Many carried ladders. He yelled for Ed to shift some archers that way. The fighting stretched along the base of the wall in a ragged line, but Castle Black had only so many defenders. The men scrambled to cover each threat. From below, Jon heard the distant crash of something smashing into timbers, likely a ram at one of the gates. "Light the oil!" a voice cried from down in the courtyard. Torches were tossed over the ramparts, igniting puddles of oil that streaked across the snow in vivid lines of flame. Screams of men and beasts erupted as some of the free folk, taken by surprise, found themselves aflame. Thick smoke billowed upward, stinging Jon's eyes. The night became an inferno of swirling sparks, black silhouettes, and desperate cries. Still, the wave kept coming. Where one grapnel fell, another replaced it. Where one giant fell to a volley of arrows, another took its place. Jon felt a numb dread. Mance's army was too large to simply demoralize. They would keep pressing until the Watch's defenses collapsed, or until a miracle occurred. Suddenly, a siege engine fired from below, a crude catapult sending a boulder hurtling through the air. It smashed into part of the wall's walkway not far from Jon, sending chunks of ice flying. Men screamed as the impact threw them backward. Jon staggered, nearly losing his bow. He tasted blood in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue, but he kept his feet, grabbing hold of a support beam. A chunk of ice collapsed from the wall's side, carrying a half-dozen watchers to their deaths. Dolorous Ed gaped at the gap in the walkway, face pale. Gods be good. They've knocked a hole right in the middle. Form up around it, Jon yelled, coughing. Reroute archers to the intact sections. Watch for climbers who might exploit the breach. Ed nodded and rushed to comply, leading men away from the shattered segment. Below, the free folk cheered, seeing their projectile strike home. Another boulder soared through the air, splintering on the sheer ice. It didn't do as much damage, but the psychological impact was real. Jon pressed a hand to his throbbing chest and forced himself to focus. Mormont had to know of this breach. He turned to a nearby brother. Warn the Lord Commander that the walkway's been partially destroyed. We'll have to rely on the far side for vantage. The man nodded, darting off into the confusion. Meanwhile, a swirl of sparks rose from a new blaze below, perhaps a store of oil gone up in flame. The heat licked at the base of the wall, melting small rivulets that refroze eye. And bizarre patterns. The wildlings hammered, roared, advanced, died. The watchers shot arrow after arrow, until some men's fingers bled from constant knocking. Time lost its shape in the frenzy. The battle raged through the dead of night. Now and then, Jon would glimpse a group of free folk retreating, only to see others surge forward. Still no sign of Mance or his direct subcommanders. Usually, Mance hung back orchestrating. That was his strength, weaving multiple attacks into one unstoppable assault. Amid the madness, Jon found himself scanning for the flash of red hair. He hated that he even thought of Ygritte while men were dying all around him. Still, every ounce of him tensed whenever a wildling archer aimed up at the parapets, or whenever he spotted a spearwife among the ranks. He told himself it was because she was a deadly threat, but his racing heart told another story. His moment of distraction nearly cost him. An arrow whistled past his ear, close enough that he felt the sting of wind. He ducked, hearing it clatter against stone behind him. Gasping, he snapped back to reality. Another arrow soared, lodging in the parapet. He realized they were targeting him specifically now, perhaps noticing he shouted commands. A shiver of cold fear pulsed through him. He moved carefully to a new vantage, crouching behind part of the wall's edge. From there, he loosed more arrows, targeting giants and men with grappling hooks. The swirl of battle expanded, shrank, and transformed in wave after wave of chaotic momentum. Through it all, Castle Black stood defiant, though the structure groaned under the strain. Finally, well past the night's midpoint, a horn from the free folks' side sounded 3 times in rapid succession, a signal to pull back. The watchers saw shapes beginning to fall away from the wall, carrying their wounded, leaving behind the dead. Giants lumbered off battered. Mammoths trumpeted in distress. The tide was ebbing, at least for the moment. A ragged cheer rose from the defenders. Men slumped against the parapets, panting, some weeping from sheer relief or from the agony of wounds. The watch had held, but at what cost? Jon sank to his knees, the bow slipping from his numb fingers. His chest burned, the bandages soaked anew with blood from his strenuous efforts. Pain lanced him with every breath, as if an icicle was lodged beneath his ribs. He turned his head to gaze out at the plain below, illuminated by pockets of burning debris. Bodies lay scattered, black lumps in the snow, some still burning. The stench of charred flesh hung in the air. Dolorous Ed stumbled over, face lined with ash and exhaustion. They're retreating, or regrouping. Jon nodded, swallowing dryly. They'll be back, he said. Mance won't stop until the wall breaks or we're all dead. Cheery thought, Ed muttered, living up to his nickname. He offered a shaky grin that was more a grimace. Come on, let's get you down. You look like you're about to topple. Jon tried to protest, but a wave of dizziness overcame him. Ed and another brother half-guided, half-carried him down the steps. Ghost padded behind, silent as ever, the direwolf's fur smeared with soot. In the courtyard, the scene was just as grim. Craters from the catapult strikes, scattered debris, piles of bodies. Brothers moved among the dead, searching for survivors. The heavy gates were scarred but still upright. Mormont stood near a brazier, haggard yet resolute, overseeing the triage of wounded men. His eyes flicked to Jon as they approached. "How bad?" Mormont demanded, voice rasping with fatigue. Jon leaned on Ed, trying to maintain composure. "We held the top, but the walkway's damaged. We repelled the climbers. They fired catapults at us." His gaze darted to the Lord Commander's right arm, which was splinted, probably a break from falling debris. "Are you?" "I'll manage," Mormont growled. "Go see the Maester. We need you ready for the next attack." Jon nodded mechanically. Ed steered him toward the infirmary, where moans and the smell of death enveloped them. The world spun as they crossed the threshold. He heard Sam's voice exclaim in concern, felt hands on his arm, but everything became a blur. The floor lurched beneath him, and blackness swept in like a closing curtain. He woke to a wave of pain that pounded behind his eyes and in his chest, as though a smith hammered inside his ribcage. Cool hands pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. He blinked, eyes adjusting to the dim glow. The flicker of a lantern revealed the familiar sight of Maester Eamon's infirmary. Sam hovered anxiously nearby, and Clydas sat with a basin of tinted water. Jon tried to speak, but his throat felt raw. Sam lifted a cup to his lips. "Drink," Sam said gently. The water soothed Jon's parched mouth, though it did little for the ache in his chest. He felt constraining bandages wrapped around his torso, fresh ones that reeked of herbal salve. Underneath, his wound was hot, as if it burned with an inner fever. He recalled the top of the wall, the swirl of arrows, the final retreat of the wildlings. "How long?" he croaked. "Only a few hours," Sam replied. "The Maester's done what he can. You reopen the wound more severely this time. You need rest." Jon exhaled a rattling breath. "They'll come again. Mance doesn't give up." Sam's eyes brimmed with worry. "Then let them come tomorrow. For now, you must heal. Please, Jon." Despite the insistent pounding in his head, Jon summoned a small smile of gratitude for Sam's concern. He let himself sink back into the cot. He felt the tug of exhaustion pulling at him, threatening to drag him into restless sleep. But his thoughts drifted north, beyond the wall, to the wildling camps, to Ygritte if she still lived. Part of him dreaded the thought of facing her again in the next assault. Another part dreaded not facing her, in case she lay among the nameless dead. Darkness claimed him once more, offering no answers. Days passed in a haze of minor skirmishes and tense lulls. Mance's horde never fully withdrew but maintained a loose encirclement, testing the Watch's defenses with smaller assaults. At times, a group of wildling climbers would appear in the dead of night on some remote stretch of the wall. Twice, they succeeded in scaling to the top, only to be met by rangers who drove them back. Casualties mounted on both sides, while the main confrontation loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon. Inside Castle Black, life became a cycle of constant vigilance, sporadic rest, and the ceaseless anguish of the wounded. The cold deepened, and food supplies ran precariously low. Fewer ravens returned with any hope of southern reinforcements. Winter hammered at the gates, a relentless force in its own right, promising to test the resolve of free folk and black brothers alike. Jon did what he could to heal, but he refused to remain idle for long. Each morning, he forced himself to patrol the walls, direct archery drills, and keep the men organized. He concealed the worst of his pain, though Sam and Maester Eamon urged caution. At night, his sleep was fractured by nightmares, of arrows whistling through the dark, of Ygritte's voice, of a silent courtyard strewn with corpses of friend and foe alike. During one quiet stretch near dusk, Jon stood atop the repaired portion of the walkway, gazing across the empty white plain. Snow flurries danced in the pale light, and the horizon seemed endless and silent. At times, he thought he could see faint hints of smoke from the wildling camp, but it might have been illusions conjured by his anxious mind. Ghost stood beside him, the direwolf's ears pricked forward, nose testing the cold wind. Jon rested a hand on the wolf's scruff. "See anything?" he murmured. Ghost made no sign. He merely stared northward, unblinking. A faint step behind John announced Dolorous Ed. "Still quiet?" Ed said, hunching his shoulders against the chill. "Too quiet, if you ask me. If Mance wants to starve us, he's well on his way to succeeding. The old bear's rationing salt pork now." John nodded. "We can't hold out forever on stale bread and pork. The men are tired, half-frozen." Ed gave a sardonic grunt. "And that's on a good day." They shared a grim chuckle, though no real humor reached their eyes. Before John could reply, the horn sounded, one short blast. A scout or some movement. John's spine straightened, and he peered over the rampart, scanning the snowy expanse. He spotted a dark shape trudging toward them, a single figure on foot. At once, watchers knocked arrows, uncertain if this was a stray wildling or some trick. The figure raised both hands, presumably to show they were unarmed. John gestured for the archers to hold fire. "Open the small postern gate, but carefully," John ordered. "I'll go down." Ed frowned. "You sure that's wise? Could be a trap." John shook his head. "One person, alone? If they try anything, we'll cut them down. But if it's a messenger, I need to know." Ed didn't argue further. John descended the steps swiftly, ignoring the hot spike of pain in his chest. He met a group of black brothers at the narrow postern gate, a small iron-reinforced door set in the larger wall. For men stood with weapons at the ready. John nodded, and they unlatched the gate, letting icy wind swirl in. The figure approached through the swirl of snow, clad in a ragged cloak. John saw the shape of a woman beneath it. At first, he dared not hope, but as she drew nearer, the torchlight caught the hue of her hair. A fierce jolt shot through him. Ygritte. His pulse roared in his ears. She stopped a dozen yards away, breathing hard, her chest heaving in the frigid air. Her cloak was damp with snow, her lips cracked from cold. One arm was bandaged in a sling, the other held up in a gesture of peace. A battered bow was slung across her back. No arrow knocked. John's throat tightened, and he forced himself forward, stepping out onto the snow. He heard the men behind him tense, but no one loosed an arrow yet. Ygritte's gaze locked on John, her eyes wide with an emotion he couldn't decipher. Desperation, sorrow, relief, or all three. Neither spoke at first. John's mind buzzed with questions. Why was she here? Was this some ploy? Was she alone? Then he saw how thin and pale she looked, as if she'd been fending for herself for days. She was shivering beneath the cloak, her hair a tangled mess. If this was a deception, it was a well-played one. Finally, Ygritte took a shaky breath. I'm done," she said hoarsely, voice barely carrying over the wind. John stared, the ache in his chest intensifying. "Done? I." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "I left him. The free folk. Or they left me. I don't care which. I can't keep fighting this war. Not like this." Her words tumbled out, raw. "I want to parley. I don't know what I want." Jon Snow. He could scarcely believe what he was hearing. He was acutely aware of the watchers overhead, their arrows trained. A single wrong move and she would be pincushioned. Yet something in her stance, in her trembling, convinced him she meant no harm. "You shot me," he said quietly, stepping closer. He noted how she winced, perhaps from guilt or memory. She nodded. And I might have done worse, but I couldn't." She coughed, hugging the cloak tighter. "I'm no crow, but I can't stand with them anymore. Mance wants to break the wall, and too many innocents are dying. I'm sick of the blood." John's heart pounded. He glanced over his shoulder. The men at the gate fidgeted, uneasy. One of them, his face hidden under a heavy hood, muttered, "Watch yourself, Snow." Slowly, John turned back to Ygritte. "If you come inside, the Night's Watch might imprison you. Or worse." She gave a bitter laugh that turned into a ragged cough. "Can't be worse than freezin' and starvin' with that lot. They're not even my clan, half of them. Then's Hornfoots, they hate me anyway." Her eyes found his, brimming with unspoken sorrow. "I've got nowhere else, Jon Snow." Silence stretched between them, heavy with memory and regret. Jon felt torn to his core. By all rights, he should treat her as an enemy. The oath demanded no quarter be given to wildlings who threatened the realm. Yet he also knew that behind the lines, men were battered, hungry, losing hope. And here stood Ygritte, alone, risking her life to approach. He realized he still cared for her, perhaps always would. The memory of her arrow remained a scar on his flesh, but the memory of her kiss was a scar on his heart. "Lower your weapons," Jon called to the watchers behind him. They hesitated, but after a tense moment, the bows dipped. Jon looked at Ygritte again. "If you truly come in peace, then you'll surrender your arms, your bow. Let us bind your hands, for safety's sake. Then we'll bring you inside to speak with the Lord Commander." She didn't hesitate. "Bind me if you must," she said. "I'm done fightin'. Jon swallowed, nodding. He stepped forward, heart hammering, and carefully slid her bow off her shoulder. She lifted her arms to allow him to check for hidden blades. She had a single knife, which she surrendered, letting him toss it to the snow. Then she offered her wrists. He hesitated, memories of their intimacy clashing with the present reality. But at last he used a short length of rope to secure her hands. His own fingers trembled. Behind them, the watchers parted, though they regarded her with open hostility. Dolorous Ed had come down from the walkway, eyeing Ygritte as if she were a ghost. "Jon, you sure about this?" he murmured. "If she's a spy, she won't harm us," Jon said. "Not now," Ed exhaled doubtfully. "Hope the old bear sees it that way." With Ygritte's hands bound, Jon guided her inside the walls. She stumbled once, feet half frozen, and he caught her before she fell. The memory of that cave flashed through his mind, catching her in playful embraces, hearing her laughter. How different it all was now. Castle Black's courtyard was a grim place, strewn with debris from the recent fighting. Ygritte's eyes darted across the scorched patches of earth, the bullet holes in the timber, the battered gates. Brothers paused in their tasks, glaring at her, some with raw hatred. Word spread quickly that a wildling, Jon Snow's wildling, had walked straight into the fortress. At the entrance to the common hall, Lord Commander Mormont stood with a handful of officers, deep in conversation. He looked up sharply as Jon approached with Ygritte. His one good eye, the other was bruised, swelling nearly shut from a recent injury, narrowed at the sight. "What is this?" Mormont demanded, voice carrying across the courtyard. Men around them halted, tension palpable. Jon squared his shoulders. "She came alone, unarmed. She says she's done fighting. She wants to speak with you." One of the officers, Othel Yarwick, spat on the ground. "She's a spear wife, a wildling murderer. Likely she's come to spy." Ygritte's lips trembled, but she said nothing, her gaze lowered. Mormont's stern gaze flicked from Ygritte's bound hands to Jon's face. He could see the conflict etched in Jon's features. With a grunt, the Lord Commander nodded once to the guards. "Bring her inside the hall. We'll hear what she has to say, but keep her under guard. If she so much as twitches wrong, put an arrow in her." A murmur went through the onlookers, but no one disobeyed. 2 guards stepped forward, each grabbing one of Ygritte's arms. Jon had to swallow a wave of protectiveness, reminding himself that these men were his brothers, sworn to protect Castle Black from potential threats. Ygritte was a threat, or had been, perhaps still was. With that, the small group moved into the dimly lit hall. A few cressets on the walls cast shifting shadows across the long tables. The place smelled of stale stew and wet wool. Mormont took a seat at a large chair near the far end, motioning for the others to stand aside. Ygritte stood at the opposite side of the table, hands bound in front of her, posture tense. Jon lingered off to one side, uncertain, his chest throbbing with every breath. "All right, girl," Mormont said, folding his arms. "Speak. Why come here alone?" Ygritte lifted her head, meeting the old bear's gaze. She looked battered, her cheeks hollow. "I've fought for the free folk all my life. she said, voice steady despite her evident exhaustion. I never wanted to kneel to no southern king, but I seen too many die. Mance means to keep pushin' until all of you are dead or we are. She swallowed, glancing at John. I ain't a skin for mercy. I can't do it no more. Mormont studied her quietly, letting the silence stretch. Then he said, deserters on our side get the rope. What do you think we do with wildlings who break bread with the crows? A flicker of pain crossed Ygritte's face. Do what you like. I'll not run. I've no place left to go. She paused, then drew a shaky breath. But maybe if you're willin', I can help. Mance is planning something bigger than all the raids so far. He's got a plan to bring down the wall for good. Or so he claims. I can show you how he might do it. That got the Lord Commander's attention, as well as a startled mutter from the men nearby. John's heart twisted. Could this be genuine? Or a ploy? Part of him feared manipulation, but in Ygritte's face, he read genuine desperation. Mormont's expression hardened. You'll need to give me more than vague warnings, girl. If I let you live in these walls, let alone feed and shelter you, I need details. She nodded, shoulders trembling from cold or nerves. Giants? They plan to tunnel beneath a portion of the wall where the ice is thinner. They'll use pitch, set a fire under the foundation, try to melt a path. Mance found old lore, stories of tunnels that once existed. If they open a gap big enough for a few mammoths, they can start tearing down the ice. A hush fell. Mormont glanced around at his officers. We know there are old abandoned tunnels, most caved in. But if they find one even partially open, or if they carve one of their own. He let the thought trail off. That could be disastrous. All the catapults and arrows in the world wouldn't help if the wall collapsed or if the free folk circumvented it below ground. Bowen Marsh, who stood near the table, eyed Ygritte suspiciously. You could be lying, sending us on a fool's errand. Ygritte lifted her chin. Then ignore me. Let Mance tear your wall down. See if I care. Yet the fire in her eyes faltered, revealing a flicker of honesty. I tell you because I'm done killin' you crows, done buryin' my folk. None of this is right. Her gaze drifted to John again, then away. Mormont drummed his fingers on the tabletop. We'll verify your story. If it proves false, or we find you've led us astray, you'll wish we'd simply thrown you off the top of the wall. He paused, studying her. If it's true, then we owe you a debt. But that doesn't make you our friend. Is that understood? Ygritte inclined her head. I understand. The old bear glanced at John. What's your counsel, Snow? You brought her here. You once lived among them, or so they say. Do we trust her word? John hesitated, feeling all eyes on him. His heart hammered. He remembered the moment she shot him, the longing in her eyes, the conflicting loyalties that had torn them apart. Would she lie to save herself? Possibly. But the way she looked now, half-starved, exhausted, trembling, it was no act he could see. She speaks the truth, John said quietly. Or at least what she believes is the truth. If there's a planned tunnel or a weak point, we need to check. We can study on men in the old mines, the old tunnels, collapse them if need be. She can guide us. Bowen Marsh snorted. That's your solution? Put her in the depths of the wall. Let her lead a sabotage mission? She might sabotage us. John refused to flinch. Then keep her guarded. But if we do nothing, Mance may succeed, and we'll all pay for it. Mormont gave a curt nod. Very well. We'll examine these rumored tunnels. Yarwick, gather men who know the old records, the old paths. Put them under guard, bring this girl along. If she leads you astray, or tries to escape, you kill her. Clear? Yarwick nodded, though he cast a baleful glance at Ygritte. Yes, my lord. Good. Mormont shifted in his seat, wincing at his own injuries. Get her out of my sight for now. Give her some water, maybe a crust of bread, but chain her in a cell. We'll question her again soon. The two guards at Ygritte's side seized her arms. She didn't resist, though her face twitched with pain, as if the mere act of standing tested her battered body. Before they led her away, She cast one lingering glance at Jon, her eyes swirling with unspoken words. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing in the hall. A heavy silence settled. Mormont rose slowly, bracing a hand on the table. "I'll not have you or anyone else coddling her, Jon. She's still the enemy, even if she's turned her cloak. If wildlings even have cloaks to turn. The moment she shows any sign of treachery, we put her down." Jon nodded, the ache in his chest intensifying. "Understood, my lord." "Good. Now see to the men. We've got fires to tend, walls to reinforce. And if that girl's telling the truth, we have a new front to guard, beneath our feet." Jon bowed his head and left the hall, his mind awhirl. Ygritte was inside Castle Black now, a prisoner. The memory of her trembling form haunted him, her words echoing. "I'm done killing you crows." He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust the love they once shared. Yet reality pressed in with every step he took along the cold stone corridors. They were on opposite sides of a war that had already cost countless lives. A single act of mercy would not wash away that blood. Outside, the wind howled, driving stinging flakes of snow across Jon's face. As he climbed the nearest set of stairs to the ramparts, he spotted the black shape of a cell block across the yard. Inside one of those dank cells, Ygritte waited, perhaps regretting her choice, perhaps still resolute. He wished he could talk to her, without bars, without ropes, to find some semblance of honesty in this madness. But war rarely granted such luxuries. For now, all he could do was tighten his fists, swallow the bitterness in his throat, and continue to prepare for the storm yet to come. Deep in the subterranean level of Castle Black, the air was damp and chill. Shackles rattled with each step the guards took, escorting Ygritte down a cramped passage lit by sparse torches. The smell of stagnant water and old stone filled her nose. She was too tired to protest, her body screaming from the day's exertion, her soul heavy with the knowledge that she was now at the mercy of her former enemies. The guards unlocked a heavy iron-banded door and shoved her inside a cell. Straw littered the floor, and a single sconce sputtered on the wall, casting dancing shadows. Ygritte stumbled, catching herself with her bound hands, and turned to see the door slam shut. The bolt clanged into place. She sank against the rough stone wall, exhaustion dragging her down. Aching from head to toe, shoulder still throbbing where the arrow had once lodged, she closed her eyes. A swirl of emotions battled within her. Relief that she was no longer alone in the wilderness, fear that she might be executed at dawn, regret for the free folk she had left behind, longing for the man she had found and lost. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." How many times had she teased him with those words, half in jest, half in admonition? Now they felt like a bitter truth aimed at herself. "I know nothing." Everything she had believed in, freedom from the constraints of southern lords, the right to live on her own terms, the bond she had with her fellow wildlings, felt shattered. Here she was in a crow's dungeon, hoping the man she'd once shot through the heart could somehow save her from the noose. She shivered, pushing thoughts of doom aside. She didn't truly want to die. There was more to life than this war, wasn't there? She thought again of the old gods, the heart trees, the endless sky above the true north. She even thought about the White Walkers, rumored to be stirring beyond the wildling camps. A threat greater than anything south of the wall seemed to comprehend. Perhaps Mance's desperation to flee south wasn't just about the cold. It was about something far worse. And here she was, stuck in a cell, caught between worlds. Time blurred. Footsteps came and went beyond her door. Occasionally, she drifted into a light doze, only to start awake at the echo of some distant shout or the clang of iron gates in the corridor. Hunger gnawed at her belly. At last, she heard the scrape of a key in the lock. She tensed, half expecting an execution squad or a guard with ill intentions. Instead, the door opened to reveal Jon Snow himself, holding a small tray with a hunk of bread and a bowl of stew, steam rising faintly in the cold air. 2 guards accompanied him, crossbows in hand, staying a short distance behind, their expressions set in stony suspicion. Jon stepped forward cautiously, avoiding her gaze at first. He set the tray on the floor near her feet, his own posture betraying tension. "The Lord Commander said you could have some food," he said, voice subdued. Ygritte stared at him, her lips parted. Finally, she managed, "Thank you." An awkward silence fell. The guards hovered in the doorway, crossbows trained. Jon cleared his throat. "Are you all right?" It was a foolish question, perhaps, but the only one he could manage in that moment. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I'm in a cell, tied up like a dog. But sure, I'm just fine." She tried to smile, but it came out twisted with sadness. Jon winced. "We have to keep you under guard," he murmured. "The men, they're on edge. They've lost brothers in these attacks." "I've lost friends too," she snapped, though there was no real venom in her voice, only grief. Her gaze flicked to his chest. "How's your wound?" He swallowed. "It aches." "Mine too," she whispered, lifting her bound hands to indicate the sling that supported her injured shoulder. "Guess we both carry scars from this war." Jon dared a step closer, fighting the urge to kneel beside her. But the guard's crossbows served as a stark reminder. "Why did you come here?" he asked, voice taut with emotion. "If you'd stayed out there, you could have died in the snow or died in the next bloody assault." "Aye, that's a choice," she said, her tone quavering. "Or maybe I'd live long enough to put another arrow in your chest. Is that what you want?" He shook his head, swallowing hard. The memory of that arrow lingered, overshadowed by the far deeper memory of nights spent curled together in warmth. "No," he said softly. She lowered her gaze. "I didn't want that either. That's why I came." For a moment, no words were spoken. The flicker of the torch in the corridor painted dancing shadows on the stone walls. Jon's heart twisted, recalling all that had passed between them. The cave, the laughter, the betrayal, the arrow. Now here she was, helpless, a prisoner of his brothers. He cleared his throat, struggling to maintain composure. "We'll investigate the tunnels you mentioned. If you're telling the truth, we'll owe you for that warning. But if the men think you're leading us astray..." She squared her jaw. "I'm not. Believe what you want, Jon Snow." He nodded, turning to go. Before he reached the door, he glanced back at the tray. "Eat, please. You'll need your strength if you're to help us find those tunnels." Ygritte eyed the food, then reached with her bound hands to tear off a piece of bread. Jon watched, a pang of guilt and longing stabbing at him. He had the irrational urge to untie her, to let her eat with dignity. But the guards behind him were watchful and would never allow that. Nor would the Lord Commander. He stepped back into the corridor, giving a nod to the guards. The door swung shut, and he heard the bolt slide home again. As he walked away, the image of her huddled in that cold cell clung to him. He tried to bury it beneath duty, telling himself again that war gave no space for mercy. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. Mercy was not just a choice. It was an obligation for any man who claimed to value honor. In the days that followed, Yarwick and a team of men delved into the lower levels of Castle Black, investigating the labyrinth of old tunnels and passageways rumored to exist beneath the wall. The labyrinth was ancient, built over centuries, and many sections had caved in or were flooded. Still, with Ygritte's guidance, chained and guarded each time, they pinpointed several potential weak points where the ice was thin or where an old path might connect to the far side. Lord Commander Mormont ordered reinforcements in these areas, along with caches of oil and strategically placed charges of black powder, a secret known only to a few among the Night's Watch, used for blasting rubble and mines. If the free folk tried to tunnel or find an opening, the Watch planned to collapse the entire section, hopefully burying any incursion under tons of ice. Ygritte's information seemed genuine. The watchmen who accompanied her at all times grew less openly hostile once they saw she was serious about helping. Still, she remained a prisoner, her every move monitored, her meals taken in her cell. On occasion, Jon saw her from a distance, being led through a corridor or outside for a brief glimpse of daylight. Their eyes would meet, and a silent longing passed between them. But no words were exchanged in those moments. Meanwhile, Mance's forces kept up the pressure. Every other night, it seemed, A new raid tested the eastern approach or the western flank. Giants hurled boulders at the wall, archers sent flights of arrows at the watchers above. Casualties continued to mount on both sides, each life extinguished, fueling the cycle of violence and grief. Within Castle Black, food supplies dwindled, men grew gaunt, and discipline frayed. Fights broke out over rations. Rumors of desertion flitted about, though Mormont's iron-fisted leadership and the threat of a swift hanging kept most men in line. Jon threw himself into the daily tasks, ignoring his own pain, ignoring the uneasy weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the arrow scar. After nearly a fortnight, the big push finally came. It was an afternoon turned gray by heavy clouds, snow swirling so thick that visibility from the top of the wall was limited to a few dozen yards. Mance used the storm to mask his approach. Horn blasts alerted the fortress, but by the time the watchers realized the scale of the attack, the free folk were already close, a massive host stretching to the horizon. Giants in the lead, mammoths dragging siege towers, thousands upon thousands of wildlings bearing spears, axes, bows, ropes, and battering rams. War horns thundered through the gale. The men of the Night's Watch scrambled, taking positions atop the wall, along the ramparts, at every gate. Archers readied arrows, stewards rushed with barrels of oil, rangers prepared the catapults. The courtyard became a chaos of shouting and clattering steel as men rushed to their designated posts. Jon was among them, ignoring the fresh wave of pain that shot through his chest. He strapped on his sword belt, slung a bow over his shoulder, and hurried up the great stairway. In the gloom of the storm, he could see only vague silhouettes moving below, but the roar of the free folk rose like a tidal wave. The first boulders from their catapults slammed into the wall. Men cursed, diving for cover. Jon found a vantage point near a catapult that Ser Jeremy Ricker manned. The old knight's face was streaked with soot, eyes narrowed. "They're ramming the west gate," Ricker shouted over the howling wind. "Gren took some men there. We'll see if it holds." Jon nodded, gripping the icy parapet. "Keep launching stones at the giants. If they get that ram in place, we're done for." Ricker barked orders and the catapult crew fired. A massive stone arced out into the swirling snow, disappearing from view. A moment later, a distant crash and a chorus of wildling shouts told them they'd found a target. But the free folk pressed on, unstoppable. More grapples flew, hooking into cracks. Ladders rose against the wall. Archers up top struggled to pick off the climbers. The wind whipped every arrow awry, adding to the confusion. Even so, the watchers managed to cut some ropes, sending men plummeting with blood-curdling screams. Time lost meaning in that infernal gale. The battle raged, a cacophony of horns, roars, and the ever-present crash of siege missiles. The giants hammered at gates with logs the size of trees. The courtyard echoed with each impact, timbers groaning ominously. Suddenly, a deafening crack reverberated through Castle Black, felt in the bones more than heard. Jon's eyes widened. One of the main gates had splintered. A surge of panic coursed through him. If the free folk poured in, the fortress would be overrun. Sure enough, horns from below signaled that the west gate had broken. Jon left the catapult crew, racing down the walkway, nearly slipping on ice slick with blood. He had to help hold the courtyard. If Mance's army took the interior, it was all over. He reached the top of a wooden stair that led down to the courtyard. There, he saw men battling at the gate's remains, a twisted mass of timber. Giants loomed behind the breach, forcing an opening big enough for mammoths. Arrows hissed everywhere. Night's Watch brothers clashed with wildlings in savage melee. Shouts and screams mingled with the unrelenting storm. Jon descended, drawing Longclaw. His chest flared with pain, but he pressed on. In the courtyard, the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, the reek of sweat, and the acrid smoke of fires. Figures darted about, locked in brutal combat. He glimpsed Ed grappling with a wildling, Sam cowering behind a broken cart, Gren lying face down in the snow with a spear in his leg. Jon lunged into the fray, cutting down a wildling who tried to hack at Gren. He pivoted, parrying another blow, spinning the attacker off balance. A savage counterattack ended that man's life. All around, chaos raged. Giants roared, throwing men aside with massive sweeps of their arms. An explosion rocked the far end of the courtyard. Likely the black powder set in one of the tunnels. Jon prayed it was the watch who'd triggered it, not the wildlings. The ground shuddered. Several men lost their footing, toppling into the snow. Jon staggered, kneeling to brace himself, nearly retching from the pain in his side. Through the swirling madness, he caught a flash of bright red hair. He looked up to see Ygritte, free of her chains, carrying a bow. She was at the edge of the courtyard, apparently unguarded. Jon's heart clenched. Had she escaped the cell in the chaos? Was she fighting for the wildlings again? Yet what he saw next baffled him. She drew an arrow and loosed it, striking a wildling behind a watch brother who hadn't seen the danger. The wildling crashed to the ground, howling. She'd saved a crow. A moment later, she spun, loosing another arrow, this time at a giant's unprotected flank. The giant roared and swung blindly, missing her. Jon realized that she was fighting on the side of the Night's Watch. She must have seized a weapon when the free folk breached the dungeon, or perhaps she'd been freed to help defend the fortress. Either way, she was fending off wildlings, not crows. He didn't have time to process the tangle of emotions that overwhelmed him. Instead, he forced his feet to move, hacking his way through the melee until he was close enough to call her name. Ygritte! She whirled, arrow knocked, eyes ablaze. For one heartbeat, they stared at each other across the carnage. The noise of war a distant roar in Jon's ears. She was covered in cuts and bruises, her hair matted with blood, yet she stood defiant. He saw relief flicker in her expression at the sight of him alive. Then a wildling jumped at her from behind, axe raised. Jon shouted a warning, but Ygritte twisted smoothly, releasing the arrow point blank. The man crumpled, blood spraying. It was madness all around. More free folk poured through the broken gate. Jon realized they couldn't hold much longer. The breach was widening. "Fall back," he shouted to the nearest brothers. To the inner rampart. The men began a fighting retreat. Ygritte, seeing him, nodded once, as if acknowledging that she would follow. Jon cut down another attacker, each movement sending agony through his half-healed wound. The snow beneath his boots was slick with blood, turning a muddy pink in places. Step by step, they retreated deeper into the fortress. Another explosion rocked the ground, perhaps someone attempting to seal a tunnel. Flames burst from a structure near the stables. Horses screamed. The courtyard was becoming a slaughterhouse. Jon found himself near Ygritte, the two of them guarding each other's flanks without speaking. She shot an arrow into a spear-wielding then who tried to flank Jon. He sliced down a savage with a cudgel who came at her from the side. In the blur of combat, it felt almost like old times, training together beyond the wall, except now they fought for their lives, and for a cause that neither had truly chosen, but both were bound to. Then came a moment of calm in the eye of the storm, a lull as the wildlings regrouped to push inward. Jon seized it, turning to Ygritte. They were both panting, steam rising from their mouths in the freezing air, blood staining their clothes. Their eyes locked. "You're fighting for us?" he managed, breath ragged. She swallowed, nodding. "I told you, I was done killing you. If Mance wants to burn this place, he can do it without me." He wanted to say more, but the next wave of free folk surged through, and the moment was lost. Ygritte spun away, loosing another arrow, while Jon braced for the onslaught. A group of then warriors advanced, well organized despite the chaos. They wielded heavy shields and axes, forcing the brothers back. Ygritte felled two with arrows before an axe-wielding giant overshadowed them, bearing down with a roar. Snow and debris swirled in a vortex of violence. All was chaos again. Shouts, screams, clang of steel. Jon found himself separated from Ygritte, forced back by a pair of wildlings. He parried, countered, felt Longclaw bite into flesh. Another man lunged. Jon blocked, twisting painfully. His chest burned. The wildling managed to bash Jon in the shoulder with a shield, sending him stumbling onto his back in the slush. Jon lay there, gasping, as the wildling towered over him, sword raised to deliver the killing blow. Jon's arms felt heavy as lead. He tried to lift Longclaw, but the blow had stunned him. The wildling grinned savagely, sword poised. An arrow sprouted from the attacker's throat, mid-laugh. His eyes bulged, and he collapsed sideways, revealing Ygritte behind him, bow in hand, a fierce glimmer of determination in her gaze. "Get up," she urged, voice tight. She reached down with her free hand, yanking Jon to his feet.